Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's 9 o'clock now. We still have a lot of people logging in, so we're going to give it just another couple of minutes and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center, and I will be your presenter today. Welcome to Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes. Just a quick note as we get started, you'll see a couple of URLs down at the bottom of the screen. This presentation is available to download all of the slides as a single PDF file. At the top link here, cbwcd.org/presentations. If you go there, it's just going to be a list of all of the different online workshops that we teach. And each of those names of the workshop titles is a link. Easiest thing to do is to right click and do save linked file as, and then download that to your computer. If you just click on it, for most browsers, it'll load the whole thing into your browser. If that happens, no big deal. Just give it a few minutes because it's a pretty large file. And then you can, through your file tab, go to save as and get it that way. In addition, this is being recorded and will be available to rewatch by the end of next week after some light editing on our YouTube channel at cbwcd.org/YouTube. That will get you directly to our online workshop playlist. However, there is a recording of the last time I taught this workshop already available. So if you want to review anything before the new one is posted, it's largely the same content, and that will be right there for you. So I am going to, into the link or to the chat, I'm going to type those two addresses in case you don't have a pen right now and you need to grab it later: cbwcd.org/presentations and cbwcd.org/YouTube. And also on our YouTube page, there's lots of other recordings of other online workshops. So if you're interested in kind of DIY and in-depth how-to advice in a long workshop format for lots of other home landscape topics, I encourage you to check that out. Before we get started, and while the rest of the participants are logging in, I want to tell you all just a little bit about the agency that I come from, who we are and what we do. We are the WaterWise Community Center, and our formal name of our agency is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. We are a special district, so similar to a school district or a fire district, a public agency that serves a specific purpose. We are located in Southern California, and our service area is the western edge of San Bernardino County. Our agency was created by a public vote back in 1949 to provide water conservation services specifically to our local service area. So we don't provide like the water to anybody's, residence or business directly through the pipes, the drinking water. But what we do is work very closely with our local water suppliers and as well directly with the public on water conservation. We say that our mission is threefold: to percolate, to demonstrate, and to educate. Percolation, as you can see here on the right, has long been the bread and butter of what we do as a conservation agency. And essentially what that has meant for many decades is we own and operate a bunch of big holes in the ground, most of which are literally old gravel pits, which have been repurposed and re-engineered to take water that would otherwise be flowing out of our community during storm events, to capture that water and allow it to clean through natural processes as it trickles down through sands and gravels and recharges our local groundwater supply. We also work closely with local water agencies to bring in imported and recycled water when available and use these facilities for that groundwater recharge as well. And that's really important in our area. We are in inland Southern California, and we have this thing underneath us called the Chino Groundwater Basin, which essentially we exist to help protect and steward. And that provides about 60% of our local water supply, which is a huge resource for Southern California. But we also know that it doesn't do as much good to work on that supply side of water conservation if in our local area we are not all using it wisely, because the average single family residential house, which is the main kind of housing situation in our local area, which is mostly residential, uses over half of the water in that household outside in the landscape. And so to that end, we also have a public demonstration garden and park open at our facility in Montclair, just south of the 10 freeway, open 6 days a week, every day except Sunday, where we demonstrate all sorts of different approaches to water-wise home gardening and conservation-based landscaping. Beautiful approaches, definitely don't need to go just rocks and cactus, kind of lots of color and habitat for songbirds and butterflies and just everything you want in a garden while saving water. We also do lots of education for all sorts of groups, from curriculum integrated K through 12 education to free workshops like this for community members. We also have more in-depth one-on-one programs for residents in our local service area to help them save water or redesign water-wise landscapes at their house. And we also do training for landscape professionals. So if you want to check out more of what we do, I'd encourage you to do a couple of things. One, you can check out our main website at cbwcd.org. But the best way to stay in touch is to sign up for a monthly newsletter. No junk. We don't share your email address with anyone else, just one email a month telling you about everything we have coming up, from workshops to in-person programs to any news about what's going on in our demonstration gardens. Super easy to do. just sign up at cbwcd.org/newsletter. I'm going to type that to the chat right now, cbwcd.org/newsletter. Highly encourage you to do that. Okay, and so with that, we are about to start, but before we do, I want to tell you just a little bit about who I am and why I'm the person talking to you about this today. For those of you who have joined us since we got started, it's quite a few of you. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the WaterWise Community Center. And I have a background in landscape architecture, kind of formal education and practice, but also before that, landscape maintenance, also landscape installation, horticulture management, landscape construction management. Before I came to work at the WaterWise Community Center, I worked in the public garden world at the Huntington Botanical Gardens for a number of years. And while I love doing commercial scale work, my real passion probably in this world more than anything else is what we all can do as community members, oftentimes with ourselves or with family and friends in our backyards, front yards, and communities, because there is so much we can do. And as we move towards having more interesting landscapes, as well as landscapes that do a much better job stewarding the natural environment, it's going to take people working at all scales, both large public projects as well as what we do as community members and or homeowners. And so that's really what I'm passionate about, and really is the focus of my work here at the WaterWise Community Center. And so in that, I've worked on rainwater capture projects from everything from large scale commercial sites to do it yourself, digging the trenches myself, wheelbarrow moving rocks around with kind of no budget at all. And I'll show you some of those different projects as we go through as sort of case studies. And so with that, we are about to get started into the main content. However, I will ask you very briefly to please fill out this quick poll that you should be seeing launching in your window, where you can tell me just a little bit about yourself and where you are joining us from today. And this really gets me some metrics that I need to track our program so we can continue to offer this free education to the public. So please fill that out quickly. I see some people are starting to finish already. Thank you very much. And for those of you who are joining us from other areas, please let us know in the chat. We're based here in Southern California, but this is one of the workshops that we teach that is really going to be pretty applicable to wherever you are, because it's dealing with basically gravity, soil, and sometimes rocks, depending on the approach. And so the plants that you will be seeing, the gardens that you will be seeing, are going to be in Southern California. For those of you in California, especially kind of Bay Area down to, pretty much Baja, if you're not higher elevations or in the mountains, or the true desert, these are going to be landscape types that directly apply to you, but the techniques are scalable. So we have people from all over the place, definitely some locals, but also Arizona, Oakland, Israel, Central Oregon, Baja, New Mexico, Santa Monica, Washington, Georgia, Kosovo, Fresno, New Mexico. Welcome, everybody. Virginia, Pittsburgh, San Mateo, North Carolina, and more. So we'll give it just another moment. And while people are finishing up, I want to tell you just a little bit about how to interact with me and ask questions today, because we have a large group, which is awesome. Currently, we have 133 people in on the workshop. So we don't have people kind of do the raise your hands and then I call on you and then your audio connects, because we find out that there is quite a bit of downtime and technical issues when we do that. And so what we do is we work with the Q&A function. So you'll see in your Zoom window, there's a little button you can press with two chat bubbles or two text bubbles that says Q&A. And that is where to ask your questions. So you can type those in at any time. And as I kind of pause between sections, I will see what questions have come in, and I will answer as many of those as I can. Because we have a very large group, I might not be able to answer every single question as I go. So I'm really going to stick to the questions that are related to what we've just been talking about. I can definitely stay later than what's noon our time, so kind of after the scheduled end of the workshop, to answer more questions about how this might apply to your yard or anything like that. But I might need to skip over some of those and stay more on the kind of the topic, the answers, where multiple people are going to be wondering the answer to that question as we go. Okay, and so with that, I'm going to end the poll. I think if you haven't finished up, don't worry at all. We're going to get going. And one question that has come in already, are we recording this session? Yes, we are recording it. It'll be posted to our YouTube page. And if you scroll up to the very top of the chat, you can get that link. So if you have comments as we go, you can feel free to put that into the chat function with one bubble. But with such a large group, questions that go into the chat are going to be most likely missed. So if you put the questions into the Q&A, that really keeps it organized in a different way, kind of on the back end on the second screen that only I'm seeing. And that lets me keep those organized and make sure that I get to all of those. So here's the outline of what we are going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit just about history. It's going to be a little bit of a case study of the hydrologic history in our local area. But for urban areas all over the place, the stories are often quite similar. That kind of sets the stage as to why we should be thinking about it, spending our time and resources on building these systems in our home landscapes. Then we're going to talk about main approaches to harvesting rainwater from home gardens. So we'll go one by one, things like dry stream beds, infiltration basins, rain barrels, stuff like that. Talk about pros and cons, some of them, getting into how to. We'll talk a little bit, just briefly, about the best plants to use with rainwater harvesting features. These will be directly for those of you in California, kind of some of the top plants to use. However, there are relatives of these plants that I'm going to show that grow local to most of this country, and some of them kind of internationally. So you'll see kind of the types of plants, and then you can, if you're somewhere else, you can look up the cousins or the analogs of those plants that you might want to use. We're going to talk about designing for rainwater harvesting in terms of what do you look at your site to kind of figure this all out, how to do a site analysis through some planning. And then to kind of wrap it up all together, we're going to go through in depth a detailed example, which will be the example of the property that I live on right now, which had a lot of kind of issues related to water for a suburban site that had to be dealt with. And so we'll go through in depth how I took on that property, looking at site analysis, design, and then construction of sort of multiple solutions to bring that all together, and then some time for questions at the end. Somewhere in there, we will take about a 5-minute break or so. And here we go. So historically, where I work and live kind of looked like this. This is literally the wash that historically would have gone through the edge of our property at the Waterwise Community Center. This wide, gravelly, kind of not really flowing water a lot of the year wash, which drains off of Mount San Antonio or Mount Baldy, which is the highest peak in our local chain of mountains. And this is kind of what things looked like before the orchards in the city moved in all around it. And that functioned how, in at least most of Southern California and in many communities at the bases of mountains, functioned, where it would be dry a lot of the year. But then when it rained, and especially if it rained hard, lots and lots of water would come down. And historically, in large storm events, the stream bed would change. Just where it runs through would pick up and move. And in a natural situation, that's completely normal, completely historic, and has some benefits to the ecology and landscape. However, and so in this area, especially because there is a nice, mild Southern California climate, as well as historic groundwater because of all that water that would come out of the mountains and infiltrate as it went through that gravelly water. It was a great place for agriculture. And so the local area developed in terms of mostly grapes as well as citrus. And so you can see here's that same mountain looking up within our local area. In addition to that, over time, the area nearby started to urbanize. And so in 1938, you can see the town of Claremont beginning to grow. Claremont colleges had started, still a lot of agriculture. And 1938 was one of the huge flood years for most of Southern California. This was a year that changed things for the developing city, because this is one of the times when there was enough city close enough to waterways that flooding really caused disaster. So this is an aerial photo not soon after that, where this, which is the wash that we've been looking at coming off of Mount Baldy, flooded, washed out roads. I mean, it was significant. So road cuts, you can see cars buried. Just for a little sense of scale, you can see some historic photos, boulders strewn across roads. And, literally there's historic accounts of bridges being dynamited to create temporary rubble dams to try to prevent the entire Claremont College complex that was starting to be there being washed out, and lives were lost. And so in response to that, the response is natural. We need to make sure that people are safe and this doesn't happen again. And at the time, the biggest concern was getting that water safely out of the communities. And so that's why things like this started to happen. These days, we've realized that there's lots of problems of just putting all of the water into creeks that have become basically channels, or rivers that have become concrete channels, and sending it out to the ocean as quickly as possible. But that's the historic context for why that happened. It was because people were dying, property was being destroyed, and this seemed to be like the solution. And so this is now what that wide gravelly wash looks like. This is the border of our property, and this is the San Antonio Creek channel. And so you can see historically, just quickly, what that meant. So this is, you can see the dotted lines were the historic creeks in our area, and then the channelization that has occurred with concrete lining from the 50s through the 80s to where it's basically all concrete. And in addition, at the same time, land use was changing. So this area went from mostly agriculture, so it's 1963, to in 2000, most of that agriculture going away. And I don't have an updated map of this, but more and more every year, so 2020 would look very different, of the remaining agriculture has turned into suburbs. And so how is that relevant to what we're talking about today? Here's how it comes together. In our community, which is the same as a lot of communities, as the creek beds were channelized, well, it turns out that most of the recharge for our very important local groundwater, and everywhere with current water supply, climate change issues, variability in rainfall, everywhere is looking to be more and more reliant on their local water supply, because imported water availability is just less reliant. So it turns out that those especially those seasonal creek stream beds, that's where most of the infiltration when it rains to recharge the groundwater supply was happening. And then as our open spaces or agricultural areas, which is mostly exposed soil, transitioned to suburbs and became coated with concrete and asphalt, well, then a lot of that other recharge has gone away. And so the estimated kind of historic infiltration just plummeted over that same time, 60s into the 90s. And so now we are working in very specific and coordinated ways to try to bring that back at scales large and small. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But that sets the stage really for why it's important. This is why we need to be thinking about this as a kind of as a society, but also as individual people. If you have your own little spot of land where you get to decide what happens there, there's some responsibility that comes with that. And so, outside of just specific stream beds or anything like that, here's just basically how it works as areas urbanize or turn into suburbs. When it rains, in just very relative terms, very general, kind of natural, quote, natural situation, about 25% of the water when it rains will go down into what's called deep infiltration, potentially recharging the local groundwater supply. And only about 10% of that actually turns into runoff. In an urban environment, the estimate, again, very general, would be more like over half of that goes off into runoff. Oftentimes it goes over surfaces, brings oil, brake dust, pollution with it. And only 5% of it is making it into that groundwater recharge. So this has reduced our local water supply and groundwater levels, and it's going to take solutions at all scales in order to help deal with that part of our water supply problem. However, it's not all about just kind of general social responsibility. As we do so, our gardens can also thrive with holding onto this water. It provides our plants with a deeper soak if we can hold on to that water. And rainwater is generally very clean, no chlorine in it, not treated, and it just does something kind of actually magical for the plants and soil if it has not rained in quite a while, to get that good natural rainwater soak in through our soils. And it can give us nice looking garden features in the process. And so it is true that no individual household is going to, solve all of our water issues. It's going to take solutions large and small. So this is a small end of a large solution that I was involved with in a project at the Huntington Botanical Gardens when we did a large construction project. And with construction projects come rainwater capture requirements these days. And so this is going in under a road, these huge corrugated pipes, which take water that would be going over the parking lot. Some of them run through more natural features, and the water ends up in here where they can hold on and then let that water kind of trickle out through gravel and eventual mesh and do some recharge. But these solutions are relatively limited where they can be put in, and extremely, extremely expensive. These aren't going to solve all of the problem. They can contribute to it. This is an example of the work we do at a large scale at the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. This is our Montclair #4 basin, so part of a chain of basins that we own and operate along the historic San Antonio Creek channel. And so these have been re-engineered, literally old gravel pits. This one happens to be directly north of our demonstration garden at our headquarters facility. And so basically what we are doing here with these gravel pits that were along the historic San Antonio Creek channel, that's why they were so good with gravel, they had all that natural stone in them, is that because that channel doesn't have any permeability to it, these pits divert water during storm events that would be leaving our community and capture as much of it as they can to try to let that water trickle down, be cleaned through natural soil processes, and recharge the groundwater supply. And so that's part of it. But there's only so much that we can do with this as well. And so you can see here when one of the basins is full, this is another basin after it's kind of drained out. So you can see the scale of it. So one of the issues with this is that actually now that the whole area has urbanized, there's really no more property for us to buy along these waterways and develop these sorts of things. So we do what we can here, but from here we need to move to looking at what we can do at the site scale with smaller solutions that essentially, if we are thinking about renovating a landscape, we should just automatically be thinking, okay, how do I have this be part of the landscape? We don't want our landscapes to look like this, which is a rather industrial approach. It's kind of the sledgehammer approach. But perhaps things like this. So this is a local resident who we provided a landscape design for as part of our landscape design assistance program available to people within our local service area. And so this is the landscape in and having grown in for a couple of years, the tree's still growing. And so we just automatically consider, okay, let's take a look at the house, the property. How can we integrate a bit of water capture into every property? And so here we have a dry stream bed coming down a rain chain, which takes the water that would otherwise be essentially mostly coming off the roof, following the natural slope of the landscape down to the driveway, and then running off. And so we take that, we harvest as much of that as possible. It helps give the garden a good soak, and then it can safely overflow and go on its way if it ever needs to. Our home landscapes are going to provide small but important solutions, starting with simple best practices of having a mulched garden that can absorb as much water into the soil as possible, good gardening practices, not parking our trucks on our landscapes so that the soil gets compacted. And beyond that, we understand that most regions are never going to be able to fully restore that pre-development hydrology. We've just built too much city. But each of our gardens can hold clean as the water moves through soil, mulch, roots. If it does leave the property, it's going to be cleaner than it would have been otherwise. And in that, if we do this kind of at a small scale throughout all of our landscapes, just a little bit, that's going to contribute to a, not going to be what it was, but it will be a new form of functional urban hydrology. What we do at home really does make a difference and does add up. And so now when we shift to, okay, what does that mean in terms of what you should actually do? There's two solutions to water scarcity if you're one of the people joining us where that's an issue. We can reduce demand and we can increase supply. And so the first thing is check off your reducing demand part. It doesn't do you any good to capture 1,000 gallons of water in your landscape when it rains if you are wasting 30,000 gallons of water a year because you have broken pipes, your sprinklers aren't adjusted, and your irrigation timer is going off 7 days a week in a landscape that only needs water maybe 1 day a week. So first thing is do a once over. Make sure you're not overwatering, turn on every part of your irrigation system, make sure things are adjusted, etc. Then we can talk about our main approaches to harvesting rainwater at home. And so here's what we're going to talk about. Mulch is going to be important. Help hold on to that water and slow it down. We're going to talk about things like permeable walkways, patios, etc. Things that can hold the water that falls on it or from nearby where it is instead of like a big concrete patio that then creates water that needs to wash somewhere. We'll talk about terraces. We'll talk about rain barrels and cisterns. And then we're going to really go into depth with what I see are the main solutions for most of us, which are going to be dry stream beds or swales and berms. We'll talk about infiltration basins and we'll talk about French drains. And then again, we'll kind of bring that all together. We'll talk about site analysis and all of that after we have the toolbox, sort of. Okay, see a couple of questions that came in, maybe from some new people who joined us. From Shmuel, I hope I did not mispronounce your name. Yes, attendees can definitely ask questions. So because we have a huge group today, we don't have people raise their hand and I call on them, but you can type questions into the Q&A where you just did. And I keep an eye on the questions coming in. And then as I transition between different parts, I will answer all of those questions. And then the other question that came in is a question about rain barrels, and we will definitely cover that topic and the question in depth when we get there. So here is the big idea and the guiding principle for catching rain when it falls on your property. This is the new paradigm. We don't want to just build concrete trenches that get water off of our property as quickly as possible anymore. We need to make sure that we are doing things safely. And if you have a huge property and a ton of water that you're talking about, definitely in the interest of safety, you might want to consult with a professional. But if we're talking urban, suburban properties and doing small practical features, you can figure it out yourself in most cases. And normally what you want to do is when water hits your property, especially where it accumulates, coming off of driveways, coming off of roofs, if you have a slope, you want to do these three things in this order. You want to slow that water down, dissipate the velocity. You want to let it spread out, and then you want to let it sink in. Slow, spread, and sink. And if it's slower, it's easier to spread. If it's spread out a little bit, it's easier to sink. Each property is different and each has a different potential to safely do this. If you're on a steep slope with clay soil, your options are going to be a little bit more limited than if you're on a gently sloping property with sandy or rocky soil. However, think about this as you're thinking about what approaches you might take and the combination of those approaches. And so I mentioned mulch. What does mulch have to do with capturing rainwater? What does mulch even mean? Mulch generally refers to anything that is loose and not alive that's covering the ground in a garden or landscape. So for areas in and around rainwater flows, wood chip mulch, gravel, and rock are really mostly what we're talking about. Decomposed granite, if you know what that is, it's the kind of very fine, almost sand-like, but sticks together, crunchy stuff that oftentimes pathways and patios and sometimes garden areas are covered with. If there's rainwater flowing across it, like if there's any sort of slope, that stuff, even though it's a great substance for flat patios and for pathways, if it's on a slope at all, rainwater flowing across it is going to make it erode, even if it's installed perfectly. So we're not going to be looking at that as much. We're going to be talking about wood chips, gravel, and rock. And so what do those do? Well, as opposed to bare soil, if there is water flowing across it, those do a few things. They stabilize the soil so you're not getting erosion. And they slow down the water, because if the water would be flowing across, it's needing to go individually into through each of those pieces of rocks or each of those pieces of wood chip. And so that slows it down quite a lot. And with it being slow, that gives the soil surface and the top, foot or so of soil much more time per volume of water to absorb that slower water instead of needing to capture water that's rushing across it quickly. Helps dissipate that velocity, gives it more contact time. And so for mulch, there's many different kinds of mulch. What normally people use these days is just mixed ground tree trimmings. People have very different opinions, sometimes very strong, about what the best kind of mulch to use is. And there's no perfect kind of mulch. Most have advantages and disadvantages. But the nice thing about mixed ground tree trimmings is that they do tend to break down nicely and improve soil, add organic matter over time, which can also increase the water holding and the fertility holding capacity of soil. And the price is right. To mulch a whole garden, you can often get mixed ground tree trimmings for free, either from a mulch giveaway program in a local area. We have at the Waterwise Community Center. We just have a huge pile for the public to take as much as they need in our parking lot all the time, or to work with services like Chip Drop, where they can match you up with local arborists and get hold of it. Again, there's no perfect solution. If you're looking into something like Chip Drop, definitely check out their whole website. Make sure that's going to be right for you. But it can be quite a bit less expensive than to buy some fancy redwood shavings. And so here's an example of just a mulched pathway area in my garden, kind of lined with just some gravel that came up from the site as we were digging trenches. And yeah, that's basically it. Here's kind of what it looks like. Over time, as the plants grow in, usually when I do a planting design, there's, the plants start kind of self-mulching, and it's really just pathway areas. So oftentimes it's just to kind of get the garden going and established. A wood chip mulch over the garden prevents soil from eroding and washing away, especially when that new garden is growing in. It also has the advantage of shading the soil, keeping it cool, and preventing evaporation of soil moisture, which means we have to water a little bit less. It breaks down and adds that organic matter, slows that water down. And just as a general, how much do you put down? 3-inch depth is generally a good starting point. Sometimes with native plants, I'll go as little as 2 inches. With fruit trees, I'll normally do 4 inches if I have enough. And not right up against your plants. You always want to leave 3 to 6 inch radius of just open soil up against your plants, because that after it does rain, that mulch can hold on to moisture, and that can cause rot if it's right up against the base of your plants and the root crown where the roots meet the branches or the trunk. And so sometimes with just wood chip mulch, depending on the soil and the site, you don't even need to build a feature to hold on to all of the water in your garden. So this is an example of a sliver of my parents' backyard, where we put in a naturalistic meadow when we redid the lawn, all low water or low-ish water plants. And they happen to live in an area where it's sandy loam soil, and the rain gutters go out into the landscape in the back, and there's wood chip mulch over that soil, and all of the water just pleasantly absorbs. No problem at all. So, and I've had this be the case on multiple properties where I have lived, where just putting some mulch down, thinking about the plants you put right next to the rain spouts, and maybe just putting a little bit of stone at the bottom of the rain gutter to dissipate some of that velocity. If there is a rain gutter, is all you need to do, and all the water just absorbs. So starting, thinking simply. I have also lived places where that absolutely is not enough, including the case study that I will show you. Gravel mulch over the garden. It's another way to go. And so this is basically what I'm talking about when I'm talking about gravel mulch. This is a local front yard in Rancho Cucamonga. It was a DIY project, first ever garden project by the homeowner, who obviously is very talented. I love the look of this rock work. And so here is, I think, gravel mulch done right. So we're not talking about all 3/4 inch just crushed gravel with a very industrial look and 2 cactuses. There is a cactus here. There's a few, but there's also some nice other native plants, wildflowers, a young Palo Verde tree, which will grow in and shade this whole area. And then the gravel over this area is a number of different sizes, achieving kind of a natural look. And when water comes down through the rain spout, or if it's washing off the driveway here in this situation, it's going to head towards this dry stream bed, which can hold some of that extra water. Because it's heading to that dry stream bed through a gravel mulched area, it's not going to be washing soil. It's not going to be eroding soil into the base of the dry stream bed. It's holding that all together. And then should this need to overflow, it's going to overflow just out to the street where it would have head just kind of like across an old lawn. Anyway, so really lovely project. And then to break it up in an area that doesn't have a whole lot of water, going across it, they also used a little bit of decomposed granite visually, which is quite nice. And so that's definitely an option as well. So gravel mulch over the garden prevents soil from eroding and washing away, shades the soil in the same way that wood chip does, slows the water down in the same way that wood chip does. If, however, you have a huge volume of water coming through because of your site situation, with wood chip mulch, it can, past a certain threshold, float away or run off with the water in large storm areas. And in those areas, gravel or even rock or cobblestone does a much better job staying in place. And then another thing, depending on where you are, is that gravel is not flammable. So in a lot of people's gardens, if you're kind of in the middle of an urban or suburban area, wood chip mulch is perfectly acceptable near a house. Now, people in more rural areas, or especially in urban wildland interface communities where wildfire is a hazard, these days you are not supposed to put wood chip mulch within a number of feet from the house. And the local guidelines for how far away you should be from the house to where you would start working with an organic or wood chip mulch are going to be different depending on where you are. Your local fire district will probably have materials and recommendations for that, but gravel would be the mulch of choice in most cases, or stone closer to the house in those urban wildland interface sort of situations. And so that's gravel mulch. And here's a situation where, gravel mulch would help. So this is an area, and this is kind of more of a commercial size drain, but especially on newer properties, there are often drains put in front or backyard landscape areas. And if you have that situation, sometimes that also comes with heavy soil compaction with the size of the equipment that they use to install landscapes these days. You can often, end up with a situation like this, where some of your wood chip mulch floats if it's starting to flood, and then it can clog the drain and cause other issues. So minimally, even if I'm working with wood chip mulch in a wider area of the yard around drains, it's always going to be rock or gravel. And I just kind of try to think of a way to make that aesthetically look nice. Let's see, there's a few questions that have come in. Is there a way to use decomposed granite efficiently? Decomposed granite is a great substance for flat areas. If you have a relatively flat patio space, we're going to talk about that in a second. That's great. Just on slopes, it will erode in rain. That's just is what it is. Even if you use the stabilized decomposed granite, even if you compact it, even if you install it perfectly. I've seen it again and again. And so the only really thing, if you have a slope, would be if you actually kind of do all of the work to turn it into terraces, where it's a series of flat areas, then it could work. But if not, for slopes, decomposed granite, it's just not the right material. So the question is rainwater harvesting good for home landscapes and larger scales in regions with arid and desert conditions? Absolutely. So where we are in Southern California, we are what's called a semi-arid climate. And in some years lately, our rainfall is similar sometimes to actual desert areas, but with the seasonality of when we get rainfalls, we're really a semi-arid Mediterranean climate. But especially for those of you coming from elsewhere, like Arizona, there's many case studies from Arizona, especially in urban areas like the Tucson area, are really leaders in rainwater harvesting. So for those of you in true deserts, you can look to that. And for those of you who are looking for examples for desert areas as well, and also good inspiration for everyone, there's a number of books as well as a great website the books are called Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands. And the website is rainwaterharvesting.com, I believe. So many desert examples. Okay. Any other questions before we move on to talking about walkways and patios? So we're talking about ground covers. Is native grass considered a good ground cover instead of using a mulch? Potentially, depending on your situation. So in certain areas, like around here in our semi-arid Mediterranean climate, I will use native grasses. However, the small native grasses tend to be on the high-ish water demanding side of high-ish. How do I say this? Even for the smaller grasses, even the low water ones are still kind of on the high end of water demand for low water and need to be mown. Or, if they're like in a really walkway area, maybe only once a year. And so there's some maintenance and there's some water demand and there's irrigation systems. So in the right place, absolutely. But if you really don't need plants growing there, it's not necessarily the default solution, because in most home landscapes, even our local native species, to avoid going fully dormant and dried out and where we're going to put them, are still going to want some irrigation. If you're in an area where you can put in, small native grasses that are low maintenance and they will survive on rainfall alone, absolutely, that can be a good solution. And that could be a way to stabilize slopes as well. We have some other questions that have come in that we will answer. So someone has just said that my microphone is going in and out. Thank you very much for letting me know. That's not a problem I normally have. Can somebody else type into the Q&A or the chat if you are having that problem as well, so we can find out if that is a problem with the audio on that one participant's end, or if it is a problem on my end? Okay, other people are not having issues. It was just one time, and I saw a blip when it. So hopefully that will continue to work out. But definitely, please. Some other people are having trouble with the audio. Okay, let me try. Let me try to switch over. I am using a microphone, which is supposed to be very reliable, but I will switch over to the computer's microphone, which should work just fine. Okay, someone please let me know. Hopefully that works and is better. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, please let me know if it happens again. Okay, then that's all the questions for now, and let's keep it moving because we have a lot to cover. So talked about just generally starting with covering the landscape, helping slow things down. So even if you're going to put in a different kind of system, even if you're going to put in a dry stream bed, you're still thinking about the water that's going to be draining into it. Even if you're putting in a rain barrel, you're going to be thinking about the water that overflows and then probably goes through your landscape. So, or maybe all you need to do is cover the soil and let the soil take that water down. Now let's talk about another thing that people often have in their landscapes: walkways, patios, spaces like that. Traditional ways to do that would be concrete, maybe brick, but mortared in, and then that accumulates water, and that water needs to go somewhere. And these days we often see that is then done with drains, which go right out to the street. That water goes away. Those drains could also clog, etc. So what do we do? Well, let's think about spaces that use materials and techniques that let water infiltrate right into the soil and capture that water. And with that, we have a few advantages. Better for the environment, but oftentimes they're also less expensive to install. And often they'll reuse materials. And you don't have those issues of drains clogging, etc. So a number of different approaches we will look at. Quick note, some of these pictures have credits to the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. Theodore Payne Foundation is a Southern California-based nonprofit that is dedicated to the conservation and promotion of California native plants. And they have an amazing garden tour where you get to see mostly residential, but also some public gardens every spring, 2 days all across Southern California. Focused on the kind of general Los Angeles and surrounding area. And it's a great chance to see all sorts of gardens and all sorts of solutions. And so I always go for the plants, but you see other great solutions because a lot of these are ecologically focused gardens as well. Definitely check out their website. They have all sorts of other cool stuff. They sell native plants. And on their website for their garden tour, which is just nativeplantgardentour.org, you can see photo archives. So this is a combination of photos that I've taken, and then they generously let me use photos from their photo archives for the classes. And so patio space. Well, if you just have a patio space for a couple of chairs, maybe you can have pavers to walk through it, but breaking it up with here is a flat area, decomposed granite for the mulch, and then native grasses and perennial flowers. Lovely. Water's going to soak right in. For a larger patio space, this is an area that most likely, I can almost assuredly tell you, was all concrete and had those issues. They broke up the concrete and then relaid the concrete like flagstone with decomposed granite in between to be a broken concrete patio. So now this has become a permeable space, which is not going to wash water down the slope. It's a great reuse of materials. It can be very cheap if you're doing the work yourself. It is a lot of work. If you have a good back and the patience to level these all, you can do it yourself. If you're thinking that that's too much, might be something better for a landscaper to do. And I will show you an example of this later on as part of the solution in my yard. And then just simple gravel patios. This is one of the nicest ways to go for a couple of reasons. If you're putting in a new patio space, both in terms of cost, in terms of low ecological impact, because normally the gravel comes from nearby, in terms of letting the water just flow down through. Really lovely. Also lovely aesthetically, because the gravel can then just wash into nearby planter areas where it becomes part of the ground cover. And by wash, I mean just kind of aesthetically, not that the rain would literally wash it. So really, really lovely approach. One of the most ecological ways to go, lets the water trickle right through. Thinking about working with stepping stones and pavers with whatever kind of mulch in between instead of long pieces of concrete, or even in a large renovation, depending on the budget, moving towards something like a very well installed gravel driveway. So this way this house is situated with a long concrete or asphalt driveway, not only would it send a lot of water that needs to be dealt with somewhere, it's sending it towards the house. And so this breaks up that driveway, actually makes it look more like a nice garden space that you might want to throw a party, but really captures that water as well in an area where there's not a lot of room really for like a dry stream bed or something like that. Here you can see the rain gutter is also just sending that chain right on down. Here's another gravel driveway. and parking area, but it's a hybrid space, so it looks quite nice and kind of blends seamlessly into the garden. We're just thinking about walkways, and are there ways to kind of break it up a little bit? Permeable pavers are also definitely an option. They need to be installed very well. This is definitely a project for professionals in most cases, and they can get quite expensive, but the look is absolutely beautiful, can be very durable, so something to consider. So that's kind of those social spaces and what you might want to put weeds down. So okay, so question, really good question. How do you suggest controlling weeds that grow into the gravel mulch? It's often an issue, and it's hard once the gravel is down to deal with it. And then question about weed barriers, and that's basically that black fabric. So yeah, I generally can't ever recommend that black fabric. It just doesn't work that well in, sometimes called weed block. It doesn't work that well long term, and you end up getting weeds on top of it, especially under wood chip mulch. Just don't do it, because as the wood chips break down, that fine kind of broken down material, which should be improving the soil and adding organic matter, is just going to be clogging all the little pores that allow water and air through in that black plastic. And then that stuff is breaking apart. You're pulling out chunks of plastic from your landscape the next 10 years, and microplastics and stuff like that are accumulating in your soil. It's just not a good scene. So the best thing you can do for your weeds is take the time to deal with weed abatement ahead of time if you know you have big issues. Those landscaping shows where it's like, hey, we brought in a crew and now you have your whole landscape redone in a day. That's not really realistic. And yes, you can get that work done in a day, but if there's weed issues on the site, there is no one day or one weekend or 1 week solution. So a lot of those landscapes, 6 months, a year later, are going to have terrible weed issues, and it's much harder to deal with it after the new landscape is in. And so oftentimes it's a solution, if you have a lot of weed pressure, that's going to take a couple of months of prep, where especially if you're like removing a lawn, that lawn's going to come out, and then you need to water some and see what comes up. And it might be roots coming back, it might be seeds, and you need to flush that out. Do some weeding, or have a landscaper do some weeding, flush it out again, try to get through that is going to be number one. Not trying to move too quickly, working thoroughly for existing plants, especially if you have Bermuda grass. Check out our recording of our Killing Your Turf the Right Way class. We go way into that, way beyond what we can go here. If it's just kind of a general seed bank, working with a technique called sheet mulching, which we also cover in that Removing Your Turf the Right Way, but works for general weeds as well, where you're working with cardboard as a temporary biodegradable weed barrier to keep things smothered for the first 6 months to a year, works quite well. And I have definitely done that with both gravel pathways as well as in water features. And then just realize that nothing is no maintenance over time. If you are in an area where there is no wildfire danger, you can look into, I'm not endorsing this because it needs to be done very well and very carefully, but there are flame-based solutions where you can use like a torch connected to a propane tank to burn out areas. That's a common solution in organic agriculture at certain scales. And then also you can look up, some people make, depending on the weeds, a vinegar solution that can then be sprayed on if it's an area that's not going to be a garden area, it's going to be under gravel. So those are some issues. However, one thing you also might want to do is just not have, if you know that that's your site, you might not want to have huge expanses of gravel, especially in those areas. So those are some thoughts. I wish I had a perfect, here's what you can put in 1 weekend and you're done solution, but that's just not realistic. If you have an existing concrete patio, can you cut joints and then infill with gravel? Absolutely. I've seen projects where that happens. I'm going to show you a little case study where something, not exactly, but similar with cutting concrete was done. Okay. What are my thoughts on using moss as a ground cover? Doesn't work where I am in a hot, dry area, so I don't have any good solution for you. And then a repeat of the name of that online workshop where I talk about those techniques for turf removal, but also that sheet mulching, which works for existing weeds. That is called Removing Your Lawn the Right Way. And you can find that on our YouTube channel the link is at the top of the chat, cbwcd.org/YouTube. Okay, let's get going. We have lots to cover. So terraces. Terraces are turning sloped areas into flat areas through moving soil around and then almost always doing something, whether it's stone, concrete, here broken concrete, to retain that slope. It's going to work well in some areas and not well at all in other areas. But it basically lets you create mulched flat garden areas. Sites of really steep slopes are often not going to work like this if it's a really steep slope. But if it's a gentle slope, like something here, you absolutely can do that. So it's a lot of work. There's a lot of soil moving. It's usually a lot of physical work or expense to build the retaining walls. If it's anything significant, you are definitely going to get into engineering and permitting. But you can create some really nice, lovely flat or flat-ish areas. And so when the rain falls, it becomes falling on a few layers of flat landscape, which again, if it's mulched and depending on the materials, allow the garden to basically soak that water in by itself. And so I really like this example, very nicely done front yard, where you can see how steep the existing slope was. So that water is going to want to run off. And so they created this series of terraces. Here is permeable decomposed granite and gravel. And then they actually do have a dry stream bed to take the roof water and then allow anything that needs to overflow off to the side. And this is going to be a lovely space. Because it's flat, they're able to put in a patio space with decomposed granite as the ground cover, which will be shaded by this lovely Palo Verde tree over time. And so you can see how this is done, a mix of water-wise and native plants. And so just for comparison, here's the neighbor's yard, classic non-functional lawn. It's too steep to be really used for an area for like sports or anything like that. And so you can see how much they were able to reclaim, obviously with quite a bit of investment, but really, really lovely terraced front yard landscape. And so that's basically terracing. We don't go deep into it, but it's a pretty simple concept. But if you have a lot of soil to hold back, definitely you're going to want to consult with landscape contractors, and depending on your local requirements, might require engineering. Rain barrels and cisterns. So this currently is oftentimes what people's minds go to when they think about rainwater harvesting. I will tell you that I am trying to change that. It can be appropriate in some situations, but we're going to talk about the pros and cons. If any of you have rain barrels at home, you know that when it starts raining, these things fill up almost instantly. And if you have a decently sized landscape, you're not going to be able to water your entire landscape, once with this. Usually it's just a fraction of the landscape once with something like this. You really need a whole series of them to make any impact. In addition, they're relatively expensive. So here's some pictures of what you would need to kind of get started. There are DIY solutions, but in addition to the cost of modifying your downspout to get water into the rain barrel here, 50 gallons, $120, but that would just get it on the floor. So you also need something to boost it up. And although you can do it with a couple of cinder blocks or something like that, depending on the look you're going for, that's another $50 if you're buying that part. So rain barrels are going to require modification of your roof gutter downspout. If you don't have roof gutters, you're going to need to put them in. Most important thing with rain barrels, a good rain barrel is going to have some sort of screening where the water comes in. The design is going to be a little bit different depending on it, but it's going to have screening to prevent mosquitoes from breeding in it. That must be maintained perfectly. If not, and that means both the screen itself, making sure that no gaps have opened up, that the frame hasn't warped or twisted over time. If you're pulling it out to clean it out and it goes back in and something gets dinged, you got to replace that. Hope you can find an exact replacement or repair it. Because if there is even a tiny opening, that's going to be 50 gallons of mosquito habitat right outside your door. And they need to be elevated to effectively use the spigot. So, but the main thing is that vector control. If you are not the sort of person to perfectly maintain them and to check them regularly, don't go with rain barrels. So here's another example, 55 gallons. You can see a different kind of screening approach. You can get instructions for how to do it yourself, but depending on where you are getting them from, sometimes you can find them used for cheaper, but these plastic drums are still not necessarily going to save you a lot of water. So what can a 55-gallon or slightly larger rain barrel do? So, or even a series of them. So here's just a theoretical example. So when you hear like it's going to rain 1 inch, or it rained 1 inch last night, 1 inch of rain falling on a 1,000 square foot roof area is going to generate 623 gallons of water. And so you can see that 55-gallon rain barrel filled up right away. 2 of them filled up right away. Then, once even a water-wise landscape does need to be watered, so let's play it out just for Southern California. Right now, we just had a series of rain events. That was great. We really needed it. We're still definitely in a drought, but it's better than not happening. Now it's the cool time of year. So we are not, if you have an established water-wise garden, you're not going to need to water that garden area for minimum 2 weeks, more likely a month. And if we get water in the next month, more rain, then it might be, another month. And so that's going to push it back, where we don't really need to use that water right away, unless we have like some potted plants on the patio and stuff. And that's could be very useful for that. But for our whole landscape area, so we might get rain and rain and rain, hopefully in the winter in our landscape, where we might not need to use that right away. Now we can always let it trickle out into a dry stream bed for that recharge or whatever. But once that landscape does need to be watered, normally in a water-wise landscape in Southern California, you're going to water depending on your plants, every 2 weeks to a month once it's established, and you're going to essentially apply the equivalent of 1 inch of water, like it rained 1 inch over that landscape area. So then we have that, maybe 100 gallons of water if we have 2 rain barrels. And then if we have a 1,000 square foot landscape area that needs its deep soak after that time, maybe it's another month has gone by. Well, then to provide that, we need to provide 623 gallons of water to do that. Most people don't realize that even in a water-wise landscape, when we do water, the actual volume of water in gallons that we are applying. And that is what it is. Most of us, in terms of gallons, use way more water at home than we think. We just never really look at it in terms of that breakdown. When we pay our water bills, it doesn't present it to us in terms of gallons. So that's still a water-wise landscape. And so you can see that a rain barrel or 2 or 3 or even 4 really isn't going to make that much of an impact on even a water-wise garden when we have our pacing. So for most people, the best use of rain barrel water ends up being filling a watering can and then tending to your potted plants. And if you want to do that, if that's your thing, that's just fine. If you're going to make sure, things are clean and you're not having mosquitoes. But you're not going to make a noticeable difference in your water use or your water bill with rain barrels in the vast majority of situations. And in terms of actually making a difference in water use, they actually tend to do a little bit better in true desert climates than they do in like Mediterranean, California climates, because desert climates get those summer thunder showers where a rain barrel will fill up multiple times throughout the summer during the time of year when people need to be watering. But here in Southern California, our rain comes in the cool time where we don't need to be watering as much in most cases. Now, if you're really passionate about trying to capture a bunch of water, you can go ahead, if you have the space, if you have the right setup and the finances, to invest in a larger cistern. And so at the WaterWise Community Center, off of our education building, we do have, this is an 1,100 gallon cistern, which still in a rain event fills up quite quickly off of that building. And so you can see it here overflowing. But I will also tell you that unless you have an extremely complicated system, which also needs to be maintained meticulously and is really more of a professional install from just only a few professionals that really specialize in it, this system is still not going to be tapped into your irrigation system. So for example, this area is surrounded by fruit trees on a high efficiency, weather sensitive drip irrigation system. And so when this fills up, this is not going to tap into that system. So right now, because it rained recently, that system's off. And it's kind of a challenge. What we do is we do eventually, connect a hose and we leave it as a trickle and we kind of move it from tree to tree. And so maybe it'll save, one watering later on in the season. But again, these trees aren't going to need to be watered for a long time. And so if another rain event is coming, we'll let it trickle out maybe into a dry stream bed nearby to do some recharge. But it's kind of a lot to manage for not a ton of benefit directly to the landscape versus a more passive kind of approach, like just putting the water into a dry stream bed to begin with. And so you can see here are some approaches. Increasingly popular are kind of this style. It's a low profile, so they can be up against the side of a house. But you can see you're paying like $2 a gallon oftentimes. Here, the rounder ones are cheaper. So this is like similar to what we have. That's $800 just for the cost, not to mention shipping, installation, needing to level the area, set that all up, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what a cistern are. Essentially, they're used just like large rain barrels. And if your rain gutters work to drain enough area, if you have the space and the budget and the inclination, you can capture a significant amount of the quote average year rain in many parts of Southern California. So around here, it's 12 inches. And so, if we really manage it, we can capture a bunch of stuff. However, then you need to use that water. So we talked about that. So here's just kind of like a case study when I played it out for what it would mean, just in terms of the cost benefit analysis. The money is not the only reason to do something like this. But first, if we're doing it for the environment, then okay, then putting it into the ground might be enough. But if we're really trying to capture that water and maybe like offset a water bill, is that potential for that? So if you use rain barrels and cisterns, it's probably not going to save money. So just to play that out, for example, assuming a 12 inches of rainfall average year, and if you have a 1,000 gallon cistern that cost $1,000 to set up, which is probably on the really cheap side, and if it captures every drop of water over that average year of a 1,000 square foot roof system, it'd capture a little over 7,000 gallons of water per year. If you break that down into what it actually costs to buy 7,500 gallons of water a year and pay for that water bill, that's only about $38 from our local water supplier. Our water is relatively inexpensive out here, but even in like Los Angeles area, that'd still be like $80 or $90. And so in our area, if you try to add up the return on investment for the financial value of that water, it's going to be over 26 years before you break even. And this thing is not going to be around for 26 years. Most likely they wear out. They're plastic that's in the sun, even though it's like high quality UV stabilized plastic. And then when that service life is done of that thing, it's not recyclable. It's going to go fill up a landfill somewhere. So unless you specifically have a reason to do so, and if you do, if you figured it out, if it's going to work for you, then go ahead, do it. But for the average person, it's not going to provide enough additional benefit versus just setting up something like a dry stream bed or swale or infiltration basin system in which the soil is basically our cistern. We make sure that that water soaks into the soil. In a light rain event, it's going to give a deeper soak to the plants around the dry stream bed, definitely to any trees that have their roots in the area. And in a larger storm event, it's going to help recharge that local groundwater table, which means that if your area is using local groundwater, and more areas are going to be, it's going to help with local water resource issues. And so that's going to really be the most functional approach for most of us. This is a professionally installed, this is actually a commercial site. This is a entrance to a private school, really beautifully installed. If we did this ourselves at home, we probably wouldn't have the equipment to move boulders this large. But you can see, I like that you can see kind of the general approach. It can be an aesthetic feature. It doesn't, as long as the water gets there through one way or another, it doesn't necessarily need to be right up against the house. And in fact, you normally would want to have your infiltration area be at least 10 feet away from the main structure if there's space. And so this is kind of a perfect distance to make sure that the foundation of the structure is not really getting soaked when we have this deep infiltration. And then it kind of separates and creates nice garden spaces on both sides of this dry stream bed with a nice simple little lumber bridge over it. So let's talk about some little kind of differentiating of terms. What is a dry stream bed? What is a swale? What is a berm? A swale, it just refers to a depressed trench of any width that either holds and infiltrates or moves water. So if the bottom of a swale is flat, it's going to hold water and let it infiltrate. If the bottom is sloped, obviously water is going to slope in that direction. Or sometimes there will be ones that slope at certain points and are flat at certain points to allow pooling. Maybe there's little rocks or whatever in between that kind of create some pooling and infiltration areas within that. But that's basically what it is. It's kind of usually longer than it is wide, and it's a fancy trench. A berm is a mound, often used downhill of a swale to increase its water holding capacity. And I'll show you an example in just a moment. So basically, if there's you wouldn't do this on a steep slope, but if there's a gentle slope, you're digging your trench, which is going to be your swale, and you're putting that soil on the downhill side so that that trench could hold a little bit more water. That's the berm. A dry stream bed is basically just a name. It's just visual. Functionally, it's a swale. Swale doesn't necessarily have to have rocks in it, but functionally it's a swale that is made to look like a naturalistic dry stream bed. So normally it has rock or gravel, or sometimes plants integrated into it for a naturalistic look. But essentially, in terms of what they do, a swale and a dry stream bed are going to be the same thing. And so I'm going to show you a quick example of it, but I just want to catch up on questions really quickly. Okay, so there was a question from Shmuel related to terraces. Are terraces also, in addition to capturing rain, like what's used for growing agricultural crops in mountains and steep topographic areas? Absolutely. Same benefit. It takes sloped areas that's hard to work with and lets the water run off and turns them into flat areas, which are easier to work on and holds onto water. Okay. How do I feel about those large carboys as a cistern? I think what you're referring to, Lee, is often for agricultural or sometimes food purposes. They kind of have a metal frame, and then there's a big plastic, essentially like solid plastic bladder, and sometimes they're available to be reused. Yeah, those work great and can be low cost if you have access to them. Just make sure you know if it's being sold used, what was in it. If it was like soy sauce or vegetable oil and it's been cleaned out well, no problem. If it was pesticides or herbicides, I would stay away from it. Okay. Karen has a question about adding compost to plants in a gravel bed without removing and replacing the gravel each time. Normally, I would, for something like that where there's gravel, amend really well before you put your gravel down. And then you shouldn't need to be adding compost continuously to those plants. If it's like an ornamental plant that you're going to want to be top dressing, I would say just keep the gravel pulled out a little bit from it. So then you can, just add a little bit of compost here and there. So Kansas, I saw a picture of rain barrels on the ledge of a raised vegetable garden. Is that reasonable usage? Absolutely. Yeah. You can definitely use rain barrels for your veggies. That's not a problem at all. Okay. Okay. Okay, that gets us through the questions for now. Let's keep going. So dry stream beds, swales, and berms. Here is a simple no-cost example of how I used a swale and a berm at a place I rented a long time ago. So this is from the porch of this weird, funky back house that was built on a slope in Altadena that my partner and I used to rent. And this was the yard. And so you can see from the driveway, it's easiest to tell kind of the slope, kind of normal suburb foothill slope where it's actually pretty steep over the course of a block. And there was a lot of water that would come to this area. So when we moved to this area or this yard, this whole area that you can see that is just dirt was this huge, like 20-foot deep old oleander hedge. And you can see some of the cut back oleanders here. There's a disease, incurable disease that's killing all the oleanders in Southern California. So it had got here. So that was just dirt and it would erode when it rained. The uphill neighbor had put concrete over their entire backyard, kindly pitched so that it all washed into this yard when it rained. And in addition to that, I never figured out what the situation was, but from underneath their concrete slab in one specific spot, a lot of water would run and erode on the slope every time it rained. And then in addition to that, there was a long asphalt alley that would wash water onto this driveway, and then it would go off that way. And so my partner and I wanted to put in a bit of a garden area, and our landlord was fine with that. And we wanted to do some rainwater harvesting, which would protect this area and just not have soil and mulch wash down into the other part of the yard every time it rained. And I was doing this, paying off school debt, working my first job out of school. So, didn't have a lot of money. Was working in the horticulture world, so I had access to cheap and extra plants, but not a big budget project. And so basically, here's what we did. At the base of this, right where the steeper slope met, it's still sloped, but the steeper slope at the toe of that slope then hit a spot that then was a lot less steep. So we took that spot and we dug essentially that trench through here that you can see, that swale. And as we dug the trench down, all of the water coming out of that trench got put on the downhill side. So you can see the mound here creating that berm. And so where it could be, it was a little bit wider. In some places closer to the parking spot that we turned into a little patio area, it got quite narrow. And in the narrow areas, we let it be sloped a little bit to bring the water to this little bit of a wider infiltration area. And so you can see how that works. This is kind of with water in it. You can see it more clearly. So the water would come down from the concrete backyard off of the slope, and it would pool up. And from this area, it would capture it behind the berm still. But when it couldn't be captured locally, it would also go to the lowest point and pool up in here. And so we have our swale and our berm. When you're building up the berm, if you're doing it yourself, you only want to go up about 6 inches at a time, and then you want to compact it some, whether it's just with your feet, with boots on, stomping it, whether it's using an actual tamper. If you kind of dig it the whole way up, or pile it the whole way up and then try to compact it from the top, it's not going to be as effective. And ideally, you want the soil to be not super wet, but not super dry. So you might, if you're going to dig, also really dry soil is harder to dig in than evenly moist soil. So before I would dig something like this, if the soil was really dry, I would actually, if there's no irrigation system, even connect just like an old style, oscillating fan sprinkler to a hose and soak it really well. Then let the surface dry down for a couple of days. If you have clay soil, longer than a couple of days, and have it be evenly moist so it's easy to dig and can also compact on the berm. And then you are also going to figure out, and we'll talk more about it in just a moment, where your overflow is going to be. So if this thing raises, in this case, the soil percolated quite well, and I never saw this overflow in the time I was there. But if it would need to overflow, we would want to choose a little spot. We'd want to make sure, even if we're not putting rock and gravel in the bottom of it, we'd want to notch out a little spot, allow it to overflow, and then you would probably want to put some rock and stuff around it so it doesn't erode. And generally, in a situation like this, if it is safe to allow this to overflow and kind of go on its way in the natural path in which it would have occurred before, that's often what you're going to want to do. But the most important thing is you're going to want to make sure you don't concentrate water and then like flood a structure on your or some other neighbor's properties. And so that's basically the concept. It's moving earth around. It doesn't necessarily need to cost anything at all. One other note is, if possible, you're always going to want the top of this berm to be as level as possible. So when the water does rise, you're controlling where it overflows, because it's going to overflow at the lowest point. And we'll talk momentarily about some tools to figure out how to do that. And so from there, we planted some fruit trees, especially on the downhill side. So when this water does soak in, the fruit trees get some access to it. A more kind of dry stream bed approach, you're going to be essentially doing the same thing, but working with rocks. And now on a lot of properties, again, if you're not dealing with the rain is coming down from a cross slope situation, and after digging, you really want to make sure that you're retaining more before it continues on down the slope, you often don't need this berm. On the typical suburban yard where I'm doing a design for, often that berm is not needed at all. And so you might see something like this here, where you're just kind of digging down and then working with rock to kind of fill in that area. If you are just digging down and you don't need to actually build the berm, what you always want to do generally is find something productive to do with that soil. You don't want to be sending good soil to a landfill. It's unnecessary and it's expensive to pay for those dumping fees. And so if you really don't have anything to do with it, depending on the size of the project, you can often, if you're renovating the rest of the landscape, just kind of put the soil here and there and rake it out. But I encourage people to think creatively if there's something cool you can do with it. So in your garden, you want to create some mounds to create either a little sense of privacy, to elevate some plants, or there's some plants that want really good drainage, and those little mounds working in some rock as well will really look great and provide better drainage for your plants. Always try to use that soil to the best of your ability. If you have really nice soil in the ground, and some people around here do, and you're going to be building some raised veggie beds as part of your project, that might be your soil to fill your vegetable beds and then amend it with compost. And that could be better than anything you could buy from a soil yard. So you have some options. And then while working with rock, a couple of words of advice. In general, you are going to be able to achieve the best look at the best cost if you're working with the rock that is local to where you live. And so for us around here and in much of Los Angeles, that's going to be kind of a mixed river rock, kind of cobble, gravel, small boulders. Often that's granite and a whole range of almost white to dark gray with swirls and little speckles and stuff. It looks nice, but even more than that, there's a few reasons to do that. One, working with your local stone is going to have by far the lowest ecological impact because that stuff is coming from close by. You actually can't relatively fit that much rock, even on a pretty large diesel truck. And so not having it trucked from across the continent is certainly going to reduce the ecological impact of your garden project. Additionally, it just tends to look more natural working with the local materials. Additionally, that aesthetically is going to be normally the only material where you can really get rock of multiple sizes. So for the local stuff around here, this is going to be really the only size where you can get everything from small pieces of gravel to mid-sized cobbles to larger cobbles to boulders of whatever size you need. Normally, when you're working with some of those exotic gravels or those quote ornamental gravels, those are only going to be available in 1 or 2 sizes. And if you can only get it in 3/4 inch size, if you're just kind of topping off the top of an ornamental pot that has a cactus in it, no big deal. If you like the look, that's great. But when you're building a whole landscape feature, if you do it with all one size of gravel, even if it's a beautiful gravel, it's going to look funny. It's going to look artificial. And so working with the local stone, you can get those options from the local soil yards. And then finally, it's much, much less expensive. So for around here, working with the local rock and gravel is going to be usually a third less, it's going to cost a third of the amount it would take to work with like the next cheapest imported gravel and stone. I went to the materials yards and priced that all out. And so, for example, if you're paying between 5 to 15 cents a pound for your local rocks and gravel, which is the range that I find around here, the next cheapest thing is usually going to be at least 3 times that much. And so another example of a very functional kind of simple approach. You often get the situation in the suburbs where there's a detached garage. Maybe it's downhill in the backyard and the street is higher uphill. And so you have a long driveway and lots of water that washes down that driveway. And oftentimes, when these places were originally built, that driveway has a little dip right before you get to the garage that's supposed to kick water off to the side. I've seen multiple situations, and one of the places I rented, that was the situation where over the years of turf or grass growing along the edge of that, the soil level actually built up to where now the garage floods every time it rains, or a lot of water sits here. And so by removing things, touching up the grade, and making sure that that then flows out into even a very narrow dry stream bed, working with rocks and gravel. And here you're able to let it get a little bit steeper quicker because you're kind of building these loose retaining walls with the larger stone. That lets that water actually drain out, not flood the garage, soak into the landscape. And should there be a lot of water, because it's a huge surface from that long driveway, then it could go out and filter into the young growing in garden, where again, we're in that mulched soil situation, which is still going to be a much better place for the extra water to go than into the structure. And so what does that actually look like from kind of a diagrammatic point of view? Well, if you're going to be building this yourself, just a few kind of general guidelines. And this is all going to be, particular to your situation, but here's generally kind of the best practices. In most residential yards, you are only going to usually end up with between 6 inches and a foot of actual pooling water when these features are filled. If you have a huge farm and you want to go deeper, go for it. I will let you know that in public places where you're going to have pooling water, whether it's something like this or even like a fountain, you are not allowed without a barrier around it to keep kids out to pool more than 18 inches of water, because it could be seen as a drowning hazard beyond that. So certainly in a front yard, I normally would not go more than a foot of pooling capacity deep, even if it's going to drain out relatively quickly. Then underneath that, you're going to have, if you are doing a dry stream bed approach, your rock and gravel. I would generally go for at least 3 inches of rock or gravel. It's going to do a much better job at preventing weeds from growing through with a 3 to 4 inch depth than just like a light scattering of gravel on top of it. It's going to do a much better job preventing any weed seeds that blow in from actually getting that soil contact and being able to grow and root in. In terms of the slopes, like how deep can you make these things, how quickly? If you are just working with small gravel, or you are not putting rock or gravel into like a swale, for example, the general guideline is for every 1 foot of depth that you go down on your slope, you should have 3 feet across. And so you don't want to go very deep very quickly, because that can cause a situation that's just going to erode, and then you'll get soil down in the bottom of your feature. It's going to get all messy. Your plants can get all messed up. But remember, that's just if you're only working with small gravel, or for example, if it's like mulched, like that first example that I showed you. However, remember that if you're working with larger stone or boulders, you can kind of be more creative, because essentially this is like a little loose retaining wall. So oftentimes when we are essentially doing our best job to shoehorn these things into a residential yard situation. And we don't have all the width in the world to design these things. We might stack rock a little bit more so we can achieve a deeper slope. And if it's a small situation like this, you can kind of eyeball it. It's not like a large commercial site where there's 3 feet or 4 feet or 5 feet of depth and there's real structural engineering and safety issues. So working with different sizes of rocks to do a good job to retain the size. But if this was just soil and mulch, that might be a little too steep of a drop. And then if you're going to have plants in the bottom, that's just fine as well. That's optional, and we'll talk about some plants for that in just a little bit. And so then what happens from there? Well, as that water trickles in, that water doesn't go just straight down. As the water trickles into the soil, it kind of makes a cone that goes out in every direction. And so that is a good part of why ideally these things are going to be 10 feet away from a structure. Now, and that's especially true of where you're accumulating a large volume of water or like a final infiltration area. Sometimes you do what you have to do. So for here, this is not 10 feet away from a structure, but certainly this is still getting things 5 feet, 4 feet away from the structure. It's much better than the alternative, which would have water potentially flooding into the structure. And then additionally, in a large rain event, it's still going to have that overflow, which is around and away from the building. And if you have clay soil, it's relatively going to expand more as it goes down. If you have very rocky soil, it's going to go closer to kind of straight down. And so you can see here again, that's the other example that we already saw. So this does get relatively deep, relatively quickly. It's probably steeper. It's definitely steeper than that 1 foot for 3 foot kind of general ratio. But you can see here how they worked with boulders, but even smaller, they kind of stacked the cobblestone, which is a more viable approach for people who are doing DIY projects at home. Now, if you happen to have either compact or heavy clay soil, there are things you can do to increase your infiltration a little bit as well. And so your options would be either one or both of the following. At the bottom of your feature, before you put down your mulch or gravel, you might go and you might loosen the soil as practically, deep as possible. So I'd go for at least a foot in case there's kind of like a hard pan layer, or just to get things going, to kind of break it up, a foot or so down. Now, in addition to that, if that is not going to, solve the problem, you can also either by digging a deeper 18 inches, probably being the deepest practical for most people depth, either a trench along the bottom, or just to create, like with a post hole digger or something like that, in individual areas, deeper little depressions in the bottom that are then filled with stone or a coarse gravel. Sometimes if you have a really hard clay layer of soil, that's only going to be 6 inches or a foot deep. So you're kind of punching through and having these gravel filled basins so that at the top, you can't even see that they're there, but there are places for water to be able to get down and percolate more efficiently. So this was a very compact area at our garden at the Waterwise Community Center, where we had a similar situation. This had been where trucks and a construction trailer have been parking. So even once we dug out our depression, it was very compact. We had a situation where there was concrete running towards a building. Again, the water's supposed to kick out this way, but it just wasn't really doing the job. And there was erosion, and then the water would get back on the sidewalk over here. So we put in this dry stream bed, and then carefully, wearing safety glasses, good form, keeping the back straight, worked with a pick to loosen that soil. So those are some options. We'll talk more about infiltration, your soil type, and all of that a little bit later on. And so let me see if there's some questions that have come in. Then we'll talk about some kind of technical details if you're going to be putting this in. So from Anna, wants to divert downspout water away from a tree that's getting too much water. Can a dry stream bed be used to divert it away and towards a garden? Absolutely. Perfect use for it. Okay, great question from Susan.
Should you add sand before adding rocks and clay soil? That's not going to do anything beneficial. And in fact, if you have clay soil, you should never mix sand into the soil. A lot of people think that that's natural. They'll make a more sandy soil type. What ends up happening is that unless you're mixing in a massive amount of sand, like 50% sand, 50% clay soil, which is a lot of work, and most people are not going to do that, you're going to be more kind of like creating a concrete mix, which can actually tighten things up even more and make it harder to work. So adding sand doesn't help. If you are going to do, and then beyond that, directly underneath that layer, it's still going to be clay. If you are going to try doing anything to actually mix into the soil, mixing in compost to add some organic matter and build some soil structure would be the thing to do. However, in really heavy clay soil or really compact soil, I have had cases like where I've done that and it just did not make any difference. So up to you whether you want to try that or not. Okay, so if you end up with a situation where you're going to be building a berm, here are some very important kind of technical tips to make sure you do it safely, because you want to make sure that you're pooling that water and not going to be causing problems when that needs to overflow. Most important thing, if you end up with a situation like this, where your house is, maybe you're draining water, it just runs down the slope. And so you're going to be putting in a dry stream bed or a swale that goes across the slope to accumulate water. You're digging it out and you're building your berm. Classic example of the exact right thing to do. One thing you want to be very sure of, which is sometimes hard to eyeball, is that if you're building your berm, you really need to make sure that the top of the berm or where that berm overflows is at a lower elevation than the base of your building. This is the situation that you absolutely want to avoid, where it'd be kind of hard to eyeball. But in this situation, that berm is just tall enough that if there's a large rain event and this fills up, before it overflows, you're going to be accumulating water through this whole landscape area, which landscape area is not necessarily a problem depending on the plants and how it's going to drain out, but also at the base of the building, which can cause damage over time to either stucco or foundations or wood, whatever. So how do you really figure that out? Because it's very hard to eyeball. Well, the easiest thing to do for most homeowners, contractors use very expensive laser levels, which are great, but really expensive and take some getting used to using them. You can rent them from Home Depot if you have a large project and look up how to use them online. But for most people, this tool, which only costs a few bucks, and is like 3 inches wide, is going to be all you need. This is called a line level. So you can get this at any hardware store, and it's going to be big box hardware stores. It's usually in the tool section where there's other levels. And this line level is made to work with this surveyor string or layout string. You can also usually find in the tools section. Comes on a reel. It's usually a neon color. And it is what this little line level is designed to clip onto and hang on. So it's not going to work and give you an even reading if you just use some twine or something like that. That's too rough. I mean, you can probably use something like fishing line or something like that. But this, if you're doing a whole landscape project, getting a roll or a small amount of this surveyor's line is not going to break the bank. And really, that's going to give you an accurate reading. You need to make sure you're getting an accurate reading. And then how this works is kind of just like a bubble level, except you can have a long line in between two landscape areas. And if it's higher on one side, the bubble won't be centered in between the lines. If it's higher on the other side, it's going to go the other way. And this is level when it is centered like this. And so how do you use that for a project like this? Well, here's what you do. You want to hit in as close as practical at, like the base of the foundation. In this case, if you want to make sure that you're not going to be pooling water at the foundation, a stake. You can also get wood stakes at the hardware store. Then on the far side of your berm, or where your berm's going to be, you can hit in another stake. You're going to securely tie, so you can pull very hard so you don't have it sagging in the middle, a line. This is a 2-person job. So normally what you would do is at one side, so you can say, side A, you're going to tie that string in and then loop the line around a few times so it's nice and tight. and then you're going to pull it so that there's no slack in the line over to stake B. Your helper is going to clip that line level onto the line about halfway through, and then guide you as you raise and lower this line along the second stake that you hit in. And they're going to tell you exactly when that little bubble is centered in between the lines, because that's going to mean that you have this line perfectly level. When you have that there, you're going to want to wrap the stake a number of times with the string to secure it, and then tie it off. And that will give you a line that's perfectly level. Once you have that line, you can use a ruler or a tape measure to take measurements. And so basically, you can measure from this perfectly even line how many inches are at point A and how many inches are at point B, which would be the overflow point of your berm. And basically, what you want to see is that there's going to be, if say the measurement at point A is 4 inches, you want to make sure that the measurement at point B is more than 4 inches, meaning that there is more distance down to the soil surface level where this berm is going to overflow and let the water go on than there is at point A. Basically means it's not going to backflow. If there was less of a distance between this level line at the berm than there is here, that would mean that the berm is closer to this level line that's above both those points, and that in fact the water would flood or pool at the base of the structure before it would go over the berm and then follow the existing grade farther down slope. So that's the most complicated concept to explain in this class, really. If you have questions, definitely let me know. But that is basically how to use a line level to make sure that you're going to be doing this safely. Now, additionally, I mentioned that because you're going to want to make sure that you can choose along this berm where it overflows, if you want to make sure that the top of your berm is level, you can use the same principle. What you could do is into the area that's going to be the berm, you can hit a series of stakes, level that line along that series of stakes, and then you can measure at any point as you're building up that berm, and you're going to be aiming to have the same measurement from the top of the berm to the line along that whole series of stakes. And that's basically how you would level that out. So it's a really useful kind of tool. I use it when I do rough grading for patios or things like that. Great, super simple, very inexpensive. Just make sure that you get stakes that are tall enough also is one thing. So like the common different sizes of the wood stakes, if you're buying a pack of wood stakes at the hardware store, I think the tallest one is 3 feet. There's not that big of a price difference in between getting the short ones and the tall ones. I'll pretty much always get the taller ones, because by the time you get down to needing to do the one that's going to be pounded into the slope lower on the other side of the berm, or if you're pounding it into a berm that you're building, you sometimes need that taller capacity of that downhill stake to get that level line. So hopefully that all makes sense. And then if you are building a berm, we talked about overflow as well. So a couple of tips. And so here would be an example. This is like a bird's eye view. If water is flowing both over the garden surface as well as maybe down from a roof gutter or a downspout, and so you're having it kind of continue down slope, and then you can see this water pooling area, and then we build our berm. And so we build our berm. We want to make sure that the whole rim of this, using our line level, is going to be level. And then we're going to choose an area where we are going to control the overflow. So this really overflow area only needs to be slightly lower than the rest of the berm. And so when the water rises, it will overflow through here. And so even if this whole berm isn't covered with rock and gravel, that overflow area, normally I will have some rock, gravel, depending on the site, maybe some broken concrete mixed in, so that when this water is flowing over that overflow, which is going to concentrate more water, that water is going to speed up again a little bit because it's kind of pouring out here, that there's no erosion or that mulch isn't washing away. It's a little bit easier to do. It's kind of like armoring it. And so here's that from a cutaway point of view, where you can see here's the top of the berm, and then it just dips down just a little bit. And remember that as you build that berm, you're going to want to compact that to the best of your ability. So here's some important tips. Ideally, settle that water at least 10 feet from building foundations, at least for the final resting area of a large amount of water. Remember to respect the existing trees and large shrubs. You don't want to be digging through major roots of your 30-foot tall, beautiful oak tree just to put in a little dry stream bed. Roots are sensitive, especially for some of our native trees. So don't dig through major roots to install your infiltration feature. If you want those plants to live, design with that in mind. Come up with creative solutions if you need to not have to dig through major roots. That might include changing where your rain gutters are, maybe having to reinstall rain gutters so that they drop water in a different part of your landscape. Make sure that water is actually going to enter the feature and make it worth it. So for example, from a roof, driveway, or area of landscape that floods or needs to drain. I have seen lots of very well-intentioned, non-functional dry stream beds, which might be pretty, but there's not actually water falling into it how they're installed. So if you're going to do that work, unless you're just doing it for an aesthetic feature, in which case do whatever you want to do, but really make sure that water is going to be accumulating or flowing into that area. That's why I teach this class in January. Hopefully for most of us, you have either recently seen some rain or you will have a chance to see some more rain. I always, before I actually install something, try to have a kind of design or at least concept in mind, and then go out in a raincoat during a storm event and make sure that water is doing what I think it's going to do, and that I'm going to be then changing where water goes in a correct way. So, dealing with weeds. We already talked about it, so I will just go over this very quickly. One other thing that I didn't mention that we talk about in that removing your turf the right way class is for sheet mulching with cardboard. That's absolutely great. If you're going to be kind of doing that temporary weed barrier in like a dry stream bed where there is a bit of a slope and a landscape contour, get that cardboard kind of close by and then wet it down with a hose a number of times. That cardboard will become more flexible. And then there are some cases where that just doesn't work. And one thing that you can do, which isn't going to last as long as cardboard, but in my case and my experience is better than nothing, is you can get for a limited area, because they cost Canada quickly, you can get builder's paper or painter's paper from the hardware store. And that comes in a roll. If you do that, get the widest one you can. Usually that's about 3 feet, and brown color only of the rolled painter's paper. The red color, oftentimes you'll see both products available, has a rosin layer in it, which is great if you spill like paint on your floor when you're doing a home painting project, and helps prevent liquid from getting through, but is absolutely not what you want in the garden. And then additionally, like some of the thicker cardboards, which look good, like a common brand for protecting floors during construction is called Ramboard that you might see. Really read the details. A lot of those advertise that they have some sort of wax or some sort of layer in them that's going to prevent liquids from getting through. That's not what you want for this. But I might use a paper like this. I've done a dry stream bed before where that's what I had, and I did like 3 layers. And then I put my rock and gravel on it, and it punctured in a few places, but in a lot of places, it did make a difference that first year in preventing weeds from coming back up. And then infiltration basins is another term that you will hear. This is an example of an infiltration basin at the parking lot at the WaterWise Community Center's demonstration facility. Infiltration basin is all the same principles apply. It all works the same way. It's just that a dry stream bed or a swale tends to be long and narrow, and an infiltration basin is kind of just more like a tub. It's really just the shape of it. It's more of a basin. And so we have in our parking lot a series of swales or dry stream beds that overflow one into another. And then before any water would leave the property, this is just a basin, which is one last opportunity for that water to infiltrate into the landscape area. So all the same concepts, just different shapes. Here's another example of this was a school garden project. where you can see down this long area, there's more of a pretty narrow swale, dry stream bed being put in. And then before that water would be done, you can see the wider infiltration basin and then the berm on the downhill side to give a wider area that water could infiltrate. And then if needed, then I'm sure were building in an overflow, and then it would go off along the same direction that the gentle slope would have taken it in the first place. There's just going to be a lot less water. And so oftentimes when people are putting these features in, it's just gravel or rock, but you can have plants down in them. So that's just fine as well. Having plants nearby or down in them actually does a better job if, for example, we're talking about pollutants, like the water is generally considered pretty clean, but pollution, air pollution and stuff like that does settle out, for example, on our roofs over the long summer here in Southern California. And that stuff is in the water when it washes out, or if it's off of a driveway, some oils or things like that might have accumulated. And actually having plant roots in the soil in the infiltration zone does extra work in helping clean the soil, because the beneficial soil organisms, oftentimes being the beneficial bacteria that lives in the root zone of plants, actually can do a really good job holding on and sequestering some of those pollutants when that water washes through. They basically exude these very micro scale, like we wouldn't know if we were digging in there, kind of slimes that capture onto that stuff really well. And so that can be done by plants being nearby and having the roots down in. But there are also some plants that we'll talk about in just a little while that do just fine being down in those areas. And there are some plants for us in California that don't need a lot of extra water. They're low water plants or low-ish water plants during the long dry season, but then they can take being totally flooded out when it is, for a number of days if needed during the rainy season. And so don't get too caught up on what this is called. Is this a vegetated swale? Is it an infiltration basin? Is it a dry stream bed? It's a beautiful part of a botanical garden that functionally holds on to water. This is at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, which is a absolutely gorgeous California native botanical garden. So what you call it doesn't matter as long as you stick to the principles and it works. And I will say for any of you who might be considering Southern California's turf replacement rebate program, where you need to put in some sort of feature that holds on to water, they have certain choices you can choose from. And don't get too caught up on, is this the exact match? Like, as long as you're putting in something that works, that sticks to the principles, you can just look at the pictures that they have of the different approaches and choose the closest one. That's just fine. Don't get too caught up on the labels. So from Annie, how do you approach different soil types in terms of slowing down water and infiltration? We will talk about that a little bit more later. And same thing about like mosquito issues in those basins. We're going to get to all of that in just a little bit. So why don't we take our 5-minute break now? It is about 10:56. We have a lot to cover, but we're doing pretty well. And so we will start just after 11. We'll start back up at 11:01, and we'll talk about how do you figure out the size that these things should be. And then we will move on to talking about other sorts of features. So let's take a brief break, and I will talk to you all soon. If you have questions during the break, remember you can type those in, and we'll start with answering some questions that have come in.
Okay, we are back, everyone. Let's start with answering some questions. Sylvia, if I do this on sandy soil where the water drains straight down rather than out. So the water is always going to go straight down and in other directions. In sandy soil, it will go more, closer to straight down. Even on quite sandy soil, as long as it's not literally just rock and gravel, it's normally a combination, but it's really going to depend. Even with sandy soil, it's a range, so it's just going to depend on your particular situation. From Rocio, what is the YouTube address to see this again? That is, I'll type it in again in the chat since it's way high up at the top now, cbwcd.org/YouTube. Will redirect directly to our past workshop playlist. So currently right now, largely the same information. There's a recording of the last time I taught this workshop. And then probably in about a week or so, I'll re-edit this, cut out some of the downtime, and then update it. But you can get the vast majority of the same content right away. Okay, so from Mark, remind him what type of mulch I would use on a fairly steep slope. Okay, if it's not an urban wildland interface area where fire is going to be an issue, a wood chip mulch, and depending on the depth of your slope, different things will work. So like the mulch that we give away for free, which is a mixed arborist trimming, the specific grind of it works well on even very steep slopes at the Waterwise Community Center. But lots of times that mulch doesn't work as well. There's a product called Gorilla Hair Mulch, which I don't like in a general garden, but does a really good job sticking to slopes. It's kind of like a shredded cedar or redwood bark. It's a lumber industry byproduct. But if you have wildfires, that's not going to be great. If you do have wildfires, it's really like vegetated material is mostly the answer, but also not too dense, because gravel doesn't work on a really steep slope, but you're not supposed to have a lot of wood chip mulch kind of biomass. So hopefully that helps. If you're buying in wood chip mulch and you have a huge slope, I would get a test amount first, put it out on the slope, and then like hit it with a hose for a while, kind of make it, like fake rain, and make sure that it doesn't wash off. So from Penny, putting in a walking path around a wetland, and there's a possibility of water coming in from both sides. Where do I put the berm if it comes from both sides? So the berm is only to hold water back that would naturally be flowing downhill. So categorically, water wouldn't be coming in from the direction where you would have your berm built, because it wouldn't be flowing down into that area. It would be flowing from a higher spot to a lower spot. So a berm is, think of a berm as like a little dam, and that should provide you with the guidance. Okay. And then last question for now from Rodolfo, can you explain underground irrigation on a gravel bed? So I'm assuming that you are meaning, and type back into the Q&A if I'm wrong, I'm assuming you're meaning if there's plants that are integrated into there, how do you irrigate them? And that's really no different than irrigating anything else. If you have a high density of plants, you can use a sprinkler system. It'll work just the same. But oftentimes it's just one plant here and one plant there. So drip irrigation might be more appropriate. And running drip irrigation is basically just the same as drip irrigation in a normal garden situation. Before the rock and gravel goes down, after you put your plants in, you would run the drip line. And depending on the plants, if the plants that are down there are more like medium water use plants than the rest of your area, if it's lower water use plants everywhere else, then you might want to put that on a different valve or have a way to turn that on independently a little more often. Just depends on the plants that you're using. Okay, so with that, let's talk about determining the size of an infiltration feature. How big should you make these things? In reality, here's what I find. Most suburban yards, the size that goes in is what's going to fit well and look nice. And that's probably not going to capture all of the water if it's, for example, capturing the water from your entire roof or half your roof area. Sometimes that's going to overflow, and then make sure to, like we talked about, plan to send that overflow somewhere where it makes sense. So most homeowners kind of take a look. They put in a dry stream bed that's going to work well and look nice, and make sure it overflows correctly.
If you're kind of more of the person who is inclined to do a little bit of math, here are some guiding principles. Some of you are just going to tune this out. Don't worry. We're just going to talk about this for a few minutes and move on. But for those of you who want to you're the type of person who wants to kind of calculate it all out, here's what can help. Remember that 1 inch of water onto 1,000 square feet does that 600 and something gallons of water. It's kind of our starting point for these assumptions. That's how I kind of started the math. It's up to you, and it depends on where you live, how much water you want to try to capture. Oftentimes, like if this is done on a commercial site with engineers, we use a term called the storm event. Are you going to try to capture all the water that would fall in like a typical 24-hour storm event, which is typically, how much water would fall, average storm event in, and then it gets more complicated as a 1-year storm event, average year, 10-year storm event, which is like a bigger storm event. Anyways, it's practical and not overkill if you're trying to aim this to capture the first inch of water that falls in a storm event. In a big storm event, that's going to overflow, but it's not so little that it doesn't make any difference. And personally, if you want to try to go for more, you can try to go for more. But 1 inch is also a first inch of water. It is a useful number because then if you want to scale the math up from there, you can use the guideline. If you want to do 1.5 inches, 2 inches, you can go from there. So if you want to plan to capture the first 1 inch of water that falls when it rains off of, for example, a 1,000 square foot roof or a driveway, and you are going to dig things out so that there's a pooling depth of 1 foot, you're going to need approximately 83 square feet of dry stream bed infiltration basin area. So 83 square feet dug with a pooling area 1 foot deep will capture the first inch of water that rains over 1,000 square feet of surface that's running off. So from there, you can use that as your guiding principle, do a screenshot of this, download the PDF from the link I shared at the beginning. You can use that to do whatever you want. So if you're going to have 6 inches of pooling depth, you can, then know that you're going to need to double that square footage. If you're doing 2 inches of rain, you can crunch these numbers there. If you have 500 square feet of roof area, 2,000 square feet of roof area, I just tried to make the easiest to manipulate numbers for those of you who want to do the math. This is total pooling depth capacity. In reality, though, your water feature is going to start draining as it starts filling. If you have sandy soil, it's going to start draining relatively quickly. Clay soil, it'll drain less quickly. And so your actual infiltration, your capacity is going to be just a little bit more than that. Again, those are things that civil engineers figure out when they're doing this for large scale developments or commercial projects, not something that anyone I know, including myself, is going to want to do at home. And then also remember that each area usually only gets water from part of the roof. So if you have 1,500 square foot roof area, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look at your roof and then kind of diagram out how much of it relatively is going to different areas. One really cool resource to do that is if you go to Google Maps website, maps.google.com. Most people don't realize that there are measuring functions there. So if you pull up your property on Google Maps, if you have a good view of your roof, zoom in and then click on the lower left. There's going to be a button that you can click to where you'll get to more of like an aerial photo view instead of the map view. So you can actually see your roof. And then if you right click with your mouse, it pulls up a selection that you can make that's measure. And then it creates a connect the dots little measuring ruler that then you can measure either length, or if you complete creating a shape, it'll give you the area in square feet of that area. So you can sort of figure out and section out how many square feet of your roof drain to each area. If you can't get a high enough resolution working on Google Maps, there's a free program you can download called Google Earth Pro, which lets you zoom in even a little bit more. And for doing that kind of roof work, it will most likely work. It should give you high enough resolution. The sizing of things perfectly for a given condition gets into some serious hydrologic engineering, goes beyond the scope of this class, and is also way more beyond what most people would find necessary. So hopefully this, for those of you who actually want to do that work, gives you those tools you need. If there's more in-depth questions, I can try to answer those. I'll probably have to hold them till the end of the class though. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, I think, in terms of the techniques are French drains. What are French drains? Basically, that's an exotic sounding term for just a trench that's filled with a large diameter gravel. It's a really simple concept that's often used in places where there's no room or opportunity for other features. So for a dry stream bed, you need a certain amount of width. But what if you need to really cram something that's going to increase your water drainage, like right next to the edge of a pathway, which is often how I end up using it, or right next to the edge of the sidewalk? It's a good way to pick up and move water from a place where you're constricted to where you have more room for a wider dry stream bed or an infiltration basin that can absorb more water. Sometimes it's also the best option to deal with the overflow out of a dry stream bed and getting that to a desired location where it's not going to cause as much of an issue. And the reason why you would want to fill that trench with a large diameter gravel, and usually that's 1.5 to 3 inch size gravel that you can get from a local landscape materials yard, is because it's the large air spaces in between those large diameter pieces of gravel that get formed when you pour large gravel into a trench that lets water hold, infiltrate, and move. And so if you do it with like pea gravel, those little round pieces, there's not going to be the void spaces, the air spaces in between each piece of gravel. That's why you need the larger diameter. And so here's an example. So I showed you a different angle from this exact swale being dug and being loosened actually by Daniel, who's on our team here at the Waterwise Community Center. And so here's what happens when this overflows. There's a large concrete area. This is the largest practical, based on the landscape around it, swale that we could put in here. And what would happen is before we put this in, there'd just be lots of eroding water and mulch and dirt that washes onto this walkway every time it rains. And so now we were able to capture a lot of it, but we would still get mulch that would wash onto this walkway and a bunch of water and stuff like that when it rained. And so we added in a French drain. So basically coming out of this, instead of just going back out into the landscape and here, we dug a trench. That trench continued along the edge of these raised vegetable beds. Trench was this wide, just about a foot deep. It's about as deep as you can kind of easily dig, a little bit deeper than the depth of a standard shovel blade. And then eventually it gets around to this wider area, which is also more French drain, which eventually on this commercial side overflows into a drain that goes into a wider swale. But all of this mess was totally cleaned up by the fact that we just dug this trench and filled it with this kind of large diameter gravel. So now that water that overflows from that swale flows in between just the little gaps here cleanly, doesn't make a mess, into out where we can handle more of it. Here's kind of what that looks like in a cutaway. If you have it along a path or a walkway, here's basically what you would do. Dig that trench, fill it. And then if you have landscape next to it, mulch, something like that, you really want to keep, especially mulch or dirt, from getting on top of this to where it could start to eventually break down and have that organic matter clog up. So sometimes I'll use just, cobblestone and other gravel. So it'll look at the tip like there's a little bit of a slope just to really hold back, any mulch, is how to do it. Traditionally, things like this would be wrapped in like the black filter cloth, kind of like weed barrier. But newer research is showing that does eventually sometimes can silt up, and it's really cleaner just to not even bother with it. The performance isn't enhanced, and it basically ends up being more plastic in the environment that's going to potentially cause problems over time. If for whatever reason you're doing it just in the middle of a landscape area without pavement, then it's kind of the same detail on both sides. And then if you have the capacity to, depending on what tools, your physical ability, and if you have compacted or clay soil, just like the dry stream bed, you can have, dig down to your foot where you're going to fill it with gravel, and then use a digging spade or a shovel to loosen the soil underneath a little bit more before you fill your gravel in to increase infiltration rates. Now, if we cut away from the other direction, as if we are looking along the dry stream bed, along the French drain, there's a couple of options. If you want the water to infiltrate in the dry stream bed, in the French drain, like the French drain is your actual infiltration feature, then ideally your bottom is going to be kind of as level as possible. so that the water infiltrates down into the soil evenly. But if you are using your French drain to move water to maybe a larger area where you can absorb more of it, then you're going to want to have it just slope kind of slightly so that some of the water in a small rain event will percolate in. But in a large rain event, if it hits the bottom, eventually it's going to be able to move some. And that's just all site specific, depending on the elevation of where water would flow into. For example, if this is connected to a dry stream bed, maybe level is just fine. Oftentimes, like if this is following a walkway with a slight slope, then this kind of could happen very naturally. So sometimes you don't even need to really think about this, but just a couple of notes in case that is relevant to you. So that's French drains. We'll talk a little bit more about the gravel that you actually use when we talk about materials, but that's a pretty small concept, or a pretty contained concept after we've gotten through everything else. So a couple of questions about that from Sarah. How do you prevent sedimentation of the gravel in the French drain? The main thing that I try to focus on managing is making sure that I don't get a lot of mulch or debris that builds up on top of it that's going to break down and clog those pores. And it's not a perfect system. I will be upfront. It is a little bit harder to manage that than it would be if you have like the depth of a dry stream bed, where if things get clogged up a little bit, it just doesn't matter as much. And so you don't want to let like a lot of organic debris, accumulate. Sometimes people will use like don't want to use gas, but a little battery powered blower. If you have a lot of it to take care of. I just kind of, in the one I have at my house, I just kind of use a rake every once in a while when there's stuff that's accumulated. And there might be a little bit of loss of efficiency over time, but still works well. Sedimentation from the sides there's no perfect answer other than the fact that it shouldn't happen super, super quickly. After many, many, many years, just like any landscape needs maintenance over time, there's a chance that things might need to be dug back up to re-increase, some of the infiltration capacity. But that's still, as I've learned from people who do kind of the municipal scale maintenance of the stuff for some of our local cities that do a good job with this, they've still kind of determined that they're leaning on making sure that people don't install that filter cloth anymore, because that still tends to clog up and be harder to maintain than just avoiding it. So hopefully that's helpful. But in general, I will still, if I have the space to put in something like a dry stream bed, I'll still favor that over a French drain, just because that maintenance is a little bit simpler. French drains for me are normally when those other approaches are not a great solution, just because they don't fit onto the site well. And so, good question from Gwen. How do I find a landscaper who really understands and can help with rainwater management? What are good questions to ask to determine? The best thing that I would say is, there's a lot of landscapers out here who would need a lot of direction to do this, or don't really understand it and they're going to maybe not install it with the slopes right. It's just going to kind of have the general look. When you're hiring any landscaper or contractor, ask to see a portfolio of their work that have done similar projects in the past, and ask for references, and then call the homeowners that they've worked for, that they've put those in, and make sure that they were installed well and they've actually continued to work after a couple of years. That's really the only way to do it. There are in different areas. Normally, I will say that landscapers that have a high focus on an ecological approach to landscaping, often but not always, ones that specialize in working with native plants from that ecological point of view, very often will also include an understanding of rainwater capture as part of the service that they offer, because they're thinking holistically about the whole landscape. Now, that's not a guarantee, but I think that's a trend, and all of the landscapers that I know of are in this area that kind of have a reputation of doing this stuff really well are also known for having that more ecological approach, often work with native plants, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so moving on, we have 40 minutes left and quite a bit to cover, so I'm going to try to keep it going, and then I will definitely be able to stay later than noon to answer any of the questions. Let's talk about rain chains, because that's part of it and they look cool. If you're capturing water from roof gutters, rain chains and downspouts. Downspouts are not only less than attractive, traditional metal downspouts from rain gutters, they're less than attractive, they can clog, and also they don't dissipate that velocity. Remember, we're going to slow, spread, and sink. So rain chains, in addition to looking cool, that water, as it bounces down from the rain chain, if it's one of those ones where there's the little kind of series of cups, is also slowly going to be dissipating a little of that velocity from the water and slowing it down just a little bit before it hits the ground. It's still going to be kind of moving, but there's also a bit of function. And so depending on the brand, there's different adapters, but essentially you're going to have an adapter that narrows the outfall into your gutter to concentrate it more onto the narrower rain chain. And those are available online. Those adapters are normally like $15 or so, I believe. And then your rain chains themselves. Measure the distance you're going to need that rain chain to drop, because oftentimes you'll need to order, depending on the length, you might need to order 2 of them, or depending on the length, you might only need to order 1. And then where that's going to drop, you're going to need to think about it. So obviously this is just an example of a rain chain product. This is obviously not going directly into a dry stream bed or anything, not functional like we're talking about. And then you're going to need to do something to anchor it as well, because if it's blowing wind a lot when it's raining, these things can blow around some. So they sell little kind of weights, and oftentimes these the bottom pieces, you would put rocks in them to kind of weigh it down and they hook in, or you can just like hit a hidden stake into the ground and some like wire or chain to, you can do something creative and less expensive than a big copper dish at the bottom. So let's look at a few examples. So here's an example from the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Tour, where you can see the roof gutter down to a rain chain, and that rain chain drops into this narrow kind of swale dry stream bed. And you can see what they did here. You can see that to concentrate water down here, they probably dug out the soil, and then they probably used that to mound up on this side, which creates interest in the garden as well, and a nice low point from both sides. So it takes the roof, takes any water that would be coming from the landscape, and you can see it's narrow here. There's a slight slope, so some of the water will infiltrate along the way. You can see they mixed in the California gray rush. This is a juncus species. So for those of you not in Southern California, other juncus or rushes often work well. Some need high water, but for example, oftentimes they can be pretty well adapted. So California gray rush is a low to medium water use plant, especially could be low water use in the shade, maybe more medium water use in the sun. I wouldn't put it in full blasting sun, but works well. It grows kind of naturally along riparian areas. And some rushes are huge. This is kind of one of the smallest ones, so really great one to mix in for that naturalistic look. And you can see where there's a little bit more space away from the house, there's a little bit more of a wider infiltration area with a little bit more depth. So this is the low point. And then you can see if that water raises and needs to overflow, rather than flowing back all the way to the house, it raises just a little bit, and then it would flow out to the street or the sidewalk where it would naturally go anyways. So really nice, clear example. If you, in your yard with your paths or whatever, have to go over your dry stream bed, that's just fine. Simple bridge here. This is a really actually nice, really high-end landscape, but very naturalistic. But they just have a plank of wood, and that's all that's needed coming down. That's still plenty of capacity for the water to get underneath. And if, depending on your situation, if you're expecting a big storm, maybe you remove it. And you can see here the rain chain, and then that's just secured down somehow. And remember, we're dissipating that velocity. So great way to do that is before it goes into, this is very small gravel, almost sandy, with wildflowers growing into it. But before it goes in to prevent that erosion, it's just hitting a little pile of rocks here. Very lovely. And then that kind of going into rocks and then into a dry stream bed. Remember, rain chains are great, but you don't need to. So this is our demonstration garden, but your existing metal downspouts, if they're working well for you, that's fine. You can still use those, but all the other principles can still apply. but you don't necessarily need roof gutters. So downspout locations are often convenient if you have roof gutters for capturing water, because you can concentrate that into a specific location. And that's where you would begin your dry stream bed or your swale or something like that. But they're not necessarily essential. Especially some people have eaves that are really difficult to work with. They don't have a fascia board for attaching gutter to, or you just don't want to go through the expense of that project. If capturing water that's sheet flowing, so just flowing off of the entire roof without gutters, is going to be what's going to work for you, then you can definitely do that. And in some cases, a long, narrow French drain or a thin, dry stream bed that really captures that flow of that water and then moves it maybe a little bit more away from the house for final infiltration area is a totally appropriate way to do that. And you will see an example of that in our example coming up. So plants for rainwater capture features. This is going to be a brief section, mostly relevant to people who are in dry or semi-dry areas. Some of the principles apply to everyone. Remember that your infiltration feature is part of your garden or landscape. So it should look nice and it can contribute to the overall design, including using plants. Because in areas like Southern California, it rains so infrequently, right along the edge of the dry stream bed, but not having the base of the plant actually down in there, pretty much any plant that does well in your garden is usually going to do well near a water capture feature, but not in it, especially if you have decently draining soil, but oftentimes even if your soil is less than perfect. Just as long as you're still choosing good plants for your like heavy clay soil, they're still going to be all right. If you want to integrate plants down into your water harvesting feature, there are fewer good choices. So we have this whole website that I talk about extensively in other workshops called the Inland Valley Garden Planner here at inlandvalleygardenplanner.org, which is created for inland Southern California, where we are, but most of the plants will apply to most of California. Some of the plants apply well to other parts of the Southwest. And on that, there is a section of helpful lists. And I have a list that I set up called Plants for Dry Stream Beds, Infiltration Basins, and Swales, which has a list of plants that are some of my favorite plants along the edge. But again, remember, you can do pretty much anything that's going to work well in your garden if you're in an area where it doesn't rain very often. And then it does have my favorite plants for right down in there, which are generally plants that don't need a lot of water throughout the year, but they can take that seasonal inundation and flooding. So here's just a few examples. Here's an example of a dry stream bed at the Waterwise Community Center in a section of California native plants, where we have a whole range of native plants along the edges. And originally didn't plant anything down in there. This is a native penstemon that just volunteered from seed, and not what I would choose to put down in a flooded area, but they'll kind of grow and die, and sometimes they'll be nice. So we just let them do their thing. Here is another dry stream bed in our more desert garden area, which is in spring. So there are native wildflowers growing in the gravel. But you can see here, again, because it doesn't rain that often, we have cacti and succulents that need good drainage kind of pretty close to the edge, and they do just fine. We just don't really have them right down in there. Here are kind of my favorite plants for the areas that flood. Western meadow sedge is a creeping meadowy grass-like plant called the sedge that doesn't need a whole lot of water. It's kind of like that higher end of a low water use plant. And eventually it'll be kind of like a uniform. This is still young meadow area, but this is a final infiltration basin in my backyard when the dry stream beds overflow. And this can take full inundation, complete flooding, and the plants love it, but they don't need it. Mixed into that, I also like to include some yarrow, which does very well. That's a ferny leaf herbaceous plant. This is what yarrow looks like as just a plant. It's an absolute great native plant for many spaces and uses, but it can also take that seasonal inundation. And so I like to mix in a little bit of yarrow for the contrast and the seasonal flowers into the Western meadow sedge. And both of these could, or the yarrow, I would say more than the Western meadow sedge, can be mixed into the bottom of a dry stream bed. The Western meadow sedge would kind of creep and fill in a lot around the rock and gravel. So I would probably only plant it to where you're going to have soil, because you'd be putting in the rock and gravel for kind of nothing if you're planting the Western meadow sedge. And then one quick note, narrowleaf milkweed, which is a wonderful native plant, which looks beautiful in the spring. That by this time of year, it's going dormant. It looks not beautiful, but is our local kind of most important habitat plant for monarch butterflies. If you're interested in that, it can spread around the garden. It's a bit of a thug, which is part of why there's weed in the name milkweed. But for kind of the bottom of a garden, where these grow naturally in Southern California is kind of on the edge of areas that are seasonally wet. And so if you put it at the edge of like an infiltration basin or a dry stream bed, that's going to kind of be its sweet spot, and it's more likely to be super happy. So that's yarrow. If you want something that has that grassy-like look, but you don't want it to spread and creep like the Western meadow sedge, your best bet in California is going to be a plant that's called foothill sedge or Berkeley sedge. Same plant, Carex tumulicola, for any of you who might do kind of the scientific names of plants. Close relative, acts the same way. Medium to low water use plant. Likes a bit of shade in hot inland Southern California in the summer, but can take full sun. It'll just go a little bit more golden. And this is a clumper. So oftentimes 18 inches to, if it's really happy, up to 3 feet wide, doesn't spread at all. And then there's that California gray rush that I mentioned earlier. And so again, check that list for more examples. For those of you who are in other parts of the area, there are still rushes, sedges, and yarrow that grows in many, many other areas and parts of the world. So, or see what your local equivalents are. And again, for rushes and sedges, they have all sorts of different properties. Some need to be like basically pond plants in water all the time. Some can take it pretty dry. So you're going to want to do the research and make sure you're choosing the right ones. And so other than plants, we have the physical materials. Getting rock. Where do you get the rock if you're doing a dry stream bed or French drain? So you would generally get them from places called landscape supply yards or building materials yards. These are sometimes places that carry also things like flagstone, or some of them carry wood chip mulch. Some of them carry the stuff for doing like outdoor barbecues. You know, it just depends on the place. But normally they have these huge bins that tractors move this material around. Sometimes they'll also sell them in like 1 cubic foot bags, which can get quite heavy, but if you don't have a truck, it can be easier to move around. And most of them also will deliver in dump trucks. So if you're doing a whole dry stream bed, oftentimes it's going to, unless you have a pretty large full-size truck, it's going to be easier to pay the delivery fee and just have the material dumped. Some of them have large enough trucks that they can kind of put multiple materials on at the same time, especially if you're ordering rock and you want multiple sizes of rock and you don't mind if it gets mixed a little bit, they can often load it on the same truck. So if you happen to be in Western San Bernardino, Eastern Los Angeles County, you can find some of the local places where you can get this material from our local landscape suppliers list, which you can also download from the same place where you can download the PDF of this presentation, cbwc.org/presentations. We have local landscape suppliers and the different materials you can get from each business. And so you can find that on there. The river rock type gravel is usually sold by what's called the scoop, which is the scoop of their tractor. Usually that's half a cubic yard, or it's delivered. So they'll, dump half a cubic yard in the back of your truck. Cobblestones are sold by the pound. And if you're doing a large amount, usually that's going to be in a large wire basket that's attached to a pallet so they can move it around or load a truck with a forklift. Large boulders are sold by the pound and delivered either in bulk or individually. Price per pound can vary significantly depending on the supplier. So what you generally want to do if you're doing a whole landscape project is call around. Sometimes you can see on their websites what they carry, visit the yards, look at samples. Oftentimes they'll let you take a little baggie of a sample, and know that at least around here, different landscape suppliers will be cheaper in one thing than they are in another. So for example, depending on the size of gravel, even if it's local river rock gravel, one place will be cheaper for one size than another, but another place might be cheaper on the cobblestone. And the price sometimes varies a whole lot. Like sometimes in one case, a few years ago when I was calling around, one place was selling basically the same thing for 5 cents a pound, then another place was selling for 15 cents a pound. And the pounds add up when you are doing something like this. So definitely go around and get samples. Large boulders can be very expensive very quickly and can also require expensive, heavy equipment to set. And I really try to avoid any rock that's so large that you would need like a bobcat, like those small kind of tractors that people sit in and they have the big scoop, because those compact the soil so much, which is not great for the plants that are going to be growing, that it's not worth it. For me, generally, I'll stay away from rock that is anything that like people can move with a dolly or a wheelbarrow, even if I'm working with professional landscapers. Or for a front yard, if you want to have a large boulder set, if you're kind of putting in what sometimes people call a status rock, it's really large, heavy boulder that can look really nice. Sometimes those stone yards will actually have a truck mounted crane where they can pick it up from the base and drop it directly into place in your yard without any equipment needing to drive onto the soil, which I highly recommend. If we're trying to let our soils absorb water, we want to avoid soil compaction. And so that's getting rock. So here's some of the stuff that I'm talking about. For our French drains, I'm really partial to 1.5 inch and larger size. Make sure it's washed so there's not a lot of fines. You can ask the soil yard. You can come look at the pile. Gravel, that can be harder to find, call around. It's definitely available in our area. And then smaller to kind of mix in a dry stream bed or for patio areas or walkways, we have pea gravel. Again, harder to find, but sometimes very nice to mix in for a naturalistic look. Can be nice in walkways. Is something that's sometimes called bird's eye gravel. And you can ask about the sizes. Pea gravel is maybe 1/2 inch and a little bit smaller. Bird's eye gravel is maybe down to like 1/4 inch. And here's when I said the wire baskets. Here's how small boulders and cobblestones often come. And then sometimes, depending on the yard, some will be wanting to sell a full pallet. Some will actually let you come, just pick out what you want, load your truck. Sometimes, and ask the process. Some of them, they'll weigh your truck or your car on the way in. Then they let you kind of load your rock, and then they weigh you on the way out. And that's how they can figure out the poundage rather than needing to weigh rocks individually. Sometimes they'll pull a pallet over for you and have you just load the pallet. Up to you. And so now no new questions have come in. So we're going to keep it moving to look at our examples and kind of pull it together. So here's an example that I really like of a Pasadena area landscape that integrates multiple rainwater harvesting strategies into a native garden. Design and installation is from a contractor and landscape designer named Andreas Hessing, who has a company called Scrub J Studios. He is very talented. And this was seen on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Garden Tour. And so here you can see in the front yard, slopes away from the house, and it's a kind of deep front yard. And so this is one of those areas where they didn't necessarily need to do anything right at the base of the downspout. The landscape was probably going to absorb it, but still to slow down that water and allow it to be a little bit easier for the soil to do its job. Put in the rain chain, both looks a lot nicer here than the metal downspout would. And that also allows a little bit of a dissipation of that velocity, slowing it down. One strategy to kind of hold that chain in place. And also, if you're pulling it off an asphalt roof, what you will notice is that a lot of sedimentation of just like that kind of sandy stuff that's in the asphalt shingles can kind of come down. Even like the roof on my house isn't that old, and I still notice it. And so rather than having that clog up your gravel over time, I really like what he did, which looks nice, is taking a large ornamental pot. If you look down into it, it was drilled out to be quite a bit wider. It was probably like a 2-inch wide hole. And some of the places where you actually buy pottery, the places that specialize in it, you can ask, not all of them, but some of them will actually drill larger holes for you for a few bucks. And so that's an easy way to clean that out. And then the water can kind of fill that. It can overflow if it needs to, but most of it trickles down. And then instead of going directly into mulch or soil, it goes into that gravel. Again, dissipates that velocity, gets it to calm down and spread out a little bit before it goes into the soil. Now, around the back is where there was really a lot to work with, or really a lot of work to do on this property. Because there was a bit of a slope in the backyard. This is an old house with a basement. And before this landscape was redone, every time it rained, water would go into the basement. They had sump pumps down there. Sump pumps always fail occasionally. So they had damage. After this landscape renovation went in, they got to get rid of the sump pumps. And so Here's another example of the same approach in the back. And so you can see here, here's a kind of a gravel pathway that's doing double duty, capturing some of that water. And here it's buried, but it kind of brings it around the side. Here's where kind of that magic is really happening. And on the side of the house, you can see here, they just left the old metal downspout. A rain chain wasn't going to do much more. In fact, it was probably going to just scatter more water onto the concrete. And so this is very appropriate. But before it goes into this French drain, gravel-filled trench, it was just kicking it onto this piece of concrete. So instead of picking up soil, it keeps the water going in the right direction. And here, not really enough room for a wider naturalistic dry stream bed. So that French drain, gravel-filled trench, young native plants growing in on both sides. And I really like the combination of some larger boulders, just some cobblestone mixed into the smaller gravel to vary up the size and make it look a little more natural. And then I really like his reuse of the old terracotta roofing tiles to provide a little bit more retention to keep the soil out and just a lovely look. And so there was a question earlier about saw cutting concrete to try to do some various different things. That question was for a patio space, but here's just an example of so it'd be probably, saw cutting concrete is not the easiest thing to do. So it's kind of an advanced DIY project, but long driveways that go towards the street are very hard areas to capture water from. And so here's one approach to do a little bit of it is they cut these squares out so that the car can just drive right over it. Some native plants that stay very low, and you can see somehow probably from just one side they dug in and they snaked in some drip irrigation. So that's a lot of work, but lovely. And I really like the way that after this grows in, also makes the driveway feel a little bit more like it's part of the garden. And so you can see here the French drain comes along, and then underneath the walkways, they just dug a little kind of tunnel for the water to go through. Now, if you're going to take that on, you're going to have to assess the condition of your concrete. In most cases, if it's no vehicles are going over it, it's just foot traffic, and you have a standard about 4-foot depth of concrete that's in good condition, it's not cracked or anything, then you could dig just a small tunnel underneath for the water to flow through. If you want to, you can put a little open pipe in it that then just has the gravel and rock on both sides to try to contain the soil a little bit more. Not a bad thing to do. Basically, what you do is before you install, you dig a hole down on each side to the depth you need to, and then you dig it deeper than your actual feature is going to be normally, because then you need some space to where you can dig in from both sides. Go as far as you can with the shovel. You don't need a full width shovel, but maybe a trenching shovel. And then eventually there's going to be a little bit in the middle that's really hard to access. If you have not a lot of rock in your soil, sometimes you can just do it by hand with a trowel. But if things are pretty tight, another tip is you can get a long 3/4 inch or maybe 1 inch piece of galvanized pipe, like from the hardware store, and it's called a 4-pound sledgehammer. It's a small sledgehammer that is pretty weighty, but you can swing it with one hand, and you smack that pipe in and you loosen and you smack that pipe in just for those last few inches that you can't really reach your access. And that'll let you poke things through. And then once you have it poked through, you can kind of loosen it up, and then it's a lot easier to pull that soil out and have your pass through. And so you can see it does that once, it does it again. And so you can see here as well, another downspout that's kicking it this way, also filtering that water through the gray rush or the common rush native plant. And you can see here, everything is well away from this inlet to the basement. So basement's not going to flood from here. And then finally, if it's a large storm event and the water really needs to go somewhere, as a final way it can go around into the front yard, where then there's this final wider area that's slightly depressed. And then if the water needs to overflow, it can do that. It's going to do that safely around the side of the house, naturally down the slope through this kind of very rambunctious naturalistic wildflower meadow with some native shrubs that will kind of hold the space together after the wildflowers are done, and it would go through the mulched garden, trickle through some of the roots of the plants, going around the plants. That will capture a lot more. And if it needs to, then just safely out into the gutter. And so I think this is very beautiful. Your aesthetic might not want as wild of a garden. That's up to you. But all the principles hold true either way. Now, also, if you look at the far side of the house where things were a bit more limited, narrow side yard is a typical place where you might have a roof that just dumps a lot of water down. And what do you want to do with that? You could install, a rain gutter potentially and move it all the way out to the front. But here, this is a perfectly good solution as well in most cases. Oftentimes in a narrow side yard, a long concrete path, which might not cause a problem in other places because it's so constricted, maybe with the runoff would cause a problem. And so nice gravel pathway that lets the water just infiltrate through. And then here in this narrow bed, a mixture of a plant that can take plenty of water, native plant, California goldenrod, that can also spread and be kind of wild. So it's kind of nice to have it in a constricted area, and some wildflowers. And that can just absorb the water down from the roof. And then the water that goes onto the pathway just absorbs right there. Here's one more picture of that driveway that's cut through. And so now we are going to kind of wrap things up to conclude, talking about designing for rainwater harvesting and then doing kind of a design analysis and looking at that, how that was installed together using the house where I currently live as the case study. So designing for rainwater harvesting. If you are going to be renovating a landscape or doing a landscape design, it's easiest to include it at the beginning along with the rest of your landscape design. Oftentimes, because you're working with slopes and where water falls and where water is coming from, you have a limited number of solutions of how this is going to work on your site. And so it's better to think this through really before you choose all your plants at their locations, because this is going to the site's going to sometimes tell you what it needs to do more so than with the actual plantings. It's also your chance to make it a nice element to look at in your garden. And don't be afraid not to get it perfect. You might need to tweak things, dig out a little here or there, move some stone around, but just make sure that if things are going to overflow, you know where that's going to go. Other things, you want to get it right the first time, but continue to observe and tweak it as necessary. And it all starts with observation, and it doesn't need to be rocket science. Where does the water come from? Is it coming from the roof, driveway, neighbor's property, whatever? How much water is it? Is it a little trickle? Is it really a lot of water? How does it move through the property? Ideally, before you might start thinking about your plans, but ideally, you might kind of have your plan kind of thought out, maybe even drawn out. And then the next time it rains, get out there in your rain gear and look at where the water is going and make sure that it's all going to work out well. Where does your water end up now? I've definitely worked with some people on doing designs for their yards where even though it's a lawn and the lawn's going to come out, there's a little depression in the lawn in the backyard where that's the final place where the water just naturally wants to pool up. Okay, that's going to be our infiltration basin. We'll dig it out a little bit more. We'll maybe make a tweak to send even more water there. But the site is already telling us kind of how things want to be set up, that you might have that, you might not have that. But if you have it, take advantage of it. How much water do you want to capture? We talked about that with design early on. Are you being really ambitious, or are you just going to capture a little bit of it? What are your good and bad places to settle water in and dig? You want it to be away from your foundation if possible. What are your opportunities to integrate it as a landscape feature and a planting zone to really make it look nice? And also, do you have good soil drainage? So what does that mean? So I encourage you to conduct at least one, but ideally a few in the area where you're thinking about putting your features in, basic drainage tests. That doesn't need to cost you anything, as long as you have a shovel. If you don't have a shovel, you can probably borrow one. Dig a few holes, about 1 foot deep, 1 foot deep, and about 1 foot wide. Doesn't need to be perfect, but about a foot by a foot. Fill it with the hose and let the water absorb. Do it again. The first 2 times you fill that hole, you're just making sure that all of the soil around that hole is saturated. Because if your soil is dry, you're not going to get a good test of your infiltration. Dry soil might either absorb water faster than it would after it's been raining for days, or sometimes severely dry soil is what's called hydrophobic. There's a temporary chemical change, and it's or a change to the properties of the soil. And when it's so dry, sometimes it takes longer to start absorbing again. So the first couple of times you fill the hole, it's just to make everything wet. The third time you fill it, start a timer. Measure how many new inches of water have drained through that hole at the end of each hour. And note that, and I'll kind of walk you through an example right now. And this can happen, if it's taking a while for those holes to drain through. The first 2 times you can do this like the following day. You just don't want to wait so long that it starts to dry out again. And so here's the example. Here's the hole that was dug. And you can see this stick across the top. You'll see how that's used in just a second. And so you fill it up and you start your timer and make a little drainage log. After 1 hour, you can see here, measuring tape or ruler, it drained out 3 inches. The reason why this stick is across the top is that it's really hard once you get out there and you're sticking your head down to eyeball where this measuring tape is level exactly with the edge of the hole in the background. So when you have your stick across the top at the soil surface, it's very easy to get that measurement. So 3 inches after 1 hour. But the reason why you need to do it for more than just the first hour is because, especially in soils that don't drain that well, this happened to be a site with clay soil, it can slow down over time. So hour 1, 3 inches. Hour 2, you see now we're at 4 inches, but we're logging the number of new inches that have drained out. So 3 minus 4, or 4 minus 3, 1 additional inch. Hour 3, sped up again. Sometimes it just happens, 1.25 inches. Hour 4, only 3/4 of an inch. And then by hour 5, just 1/4 inch. So for horticulture, for growing plants, this, when you add it all up and you create the average, is going to be relatively slow draining soil. But for the purposes of rainwater capture, remember, we're just thinking about, is this going to drain out our 6 inches, 1 foot, no more than 18 inches usually of water within an appropriate amount of time? And so even if this infiltration rate is down at 3/4 of an inch, if it's draining 3/4 of an inch per hour over the course of 24 hours, we're still going to have plenty of drainage, even though this is clay soil. Sometimes people, if you have really compact clay soil, it might be even less than that. So that's what you want to know. So even soil that's kind of slow draining for the plants is often, for a 1 foot deep infiltration basin, just fine. So pooling and drainage. We talked about no more than 18 inches. What the key thing is for mosquitoes, we get a lot of questions about that. You just need to make sure that your infiltration is going to work, that within 72 hours of the end of a storm event, that water has drained through. So you have 3 days. And the reason why is because the life cycle of a mosquito, from an egg hatching to it being a flying mosquito, is 72 hours. And so if it dries out before then, the mosquito larvae, which are aquatic, are going to die. So even if your infiltration rate is only 1/4 of an inch per hour, in a 72-hour period, you'll still infiltrate 18 inches of standing water, but it's best to be sure, because you really don't want to put a lot of work into building something that's going to be mosquito habitat. And then remember your best practices: mulch, avoiding adding plants if you want, avoiding soil compaction, and all of that. And so in the last few minutes, we're going to pull it together with this design for my yard. So when I moved to my current property in Pomona a little over 3 years ago, there were some serious issues. So when it rained, it's a light slope from the street down to the bottom of the yard, but enough that water moves in that direction. And the first time it rained when we were there, we found out that it moves enough water right to the base of the house that gets stuck there, that we are walking through, about an inch of water, which is all stuck up against the foundation. When it rains, the driveway would flood. Again, not deep, but enough water up against the house that we don't want that. Quite inconvenient. Here's what would happen when it was done raining. It would just all kind of basin and sit there. And then even around the bit of this that can get around to the backyard would also sit up against the house, just because of how a concrete walkway went through there, which created a dam in between the house and the yard. And so what I like to do is I like to just grab a screenshot or print out from Google Maps or Google Earth, so I can kind of chart this out. And so this is how water would fall on the property. We would have water coming down this long driveway. enough of it would come out to here. And we also had water that would come off the roof, no gutters. And we have these weird curved eaves. So gutters would be hard to put on, no fascia board to attach the gutters to. And so we get this area flooded here. We get flooding here. We get flooding here. You know, there's one area where water would come down off the roof and it would go just fine. And a large rain event just over the slope of the landscape, we get water that flows to the south. There's a big backyard here. The house and landscape itself were both trashed, but it was on a big lot. And so for someone who does what I do, that's why we bought the house. But there was just in the soil before you got to this back wall, a slight low point that would accumulate water naturally just from this one section. And so maybe we're going to use that for something down at the bottom. And so we kind of charted out where the water comes from, how much, what the issues are. Also knowing that I was probably going to need to do some digging up here to move water or capture some water, noting anything else that you know is going to be relevant. So one thing when I had to redo the plumbing to the house that I found out that was going to be relevant is that the main water line had been replaced at some point in time, which was probably needed, but they didn't do a good job with the trenching. And that water main line is only about 6 inches deep. And not wanting to replace that main line that was otherwise working well, that if I was going to dig a swale or a dry stream bed through here, that would be some sort of constriction. And so here's just a picture from the back where we would get through here a little bit of water pooling in some areas, but kind of just on this downward downslope trend. And here you can see this was that final little hint of a pooling spot. But that tells us this is the low point in this area. So maybe we're going to do something with that. And also remember, you're going to be thinking about what your goals are. So our goals were to turn a flooding problem into a resource for the landscape, to create a garden feature in the process. We wanted to create a zone for a moister meadow area. We weren't going to have any lawn, but we wanted a place to, sit, put our feet in the grass on a nice day. Allow the flooding water from the front to travel to the backyard where it has more room to absorb, because there just wasn't water. Everything went downhill to the front of the house where it was flooding. There's not a lot of space to deal with it there. And we wanted to create a series of opportunities for water to absorb as it traveled to the backyard to hydrate different parts of the yard when it rains, but have enough capacity to capture it down at the bottom in a big storm event. And so take as long as you need to absorb. Think creatively about potential solution, scratch your head over it. And here's the plan of what we did. And so I can see it's 11:59 now. We're going to go just a couple minutes of over 12, but just a couple minutes to show you the pictures of how this went in. So here was the plan. So in the front, here's where we used our French drain solution, our gravel-filled trench. Because the slope goes down this way, because then it pools right at the base of the house where we also have our front walkway to the house, I didn't want to put in a dry stream bed. We didn't have a lot of room. The dry stream bed would have been right up against the walkway, which would mean if someone was visiting, maybe older relatives, if the pathway goes right down into it, someone could roll their ankle, even fall down into it. But if we pushed it farther upslope, then it wasn't going to prevent the flooding problem here. So perfect solution, French drain right up against the walkway. And the bottom of that was going to go slightly this way. So it infiltrate water in a small rain event under the path, and then follow the slope of the driveway along the edge. So it can soak in water as needed through this whole flood area. And then we let it get under the path, break up the walkway just through this area, put in some stepping stones, and then let it get through to a narrow dry stream bed where we didn't have a lot of room in the landscape. We had some raised vegetable beds here, kind of a constriction point, and we wanted a nice planting area up against our patio. Narrow dry stream bed. And then in that dry stream bed, as it goes down slope, we were going to have a couple of areas where it gets wider, a bridge over it, and then a final sunken meadow right where that low spot was. That could be our infiltration basin. And then intentionally, I'd make sure I had one final low spot here so that that water, if it was necessary, could overflow and it would just go towards the fruit trees at the bottom of the property. Now, there's a few other things we're going to do in the process to make it all work. We had a huge and also busted up, broken, heaving, and hazardous concrete patio The worst part of it was farthest out, and it was bigger than we needed. So we're going to break up the size of that to have less impermeable surface. Going to reuse that concrete for a new separate patio that we are going to flatten out, kind of creating a terrace. So with all of the soil we were going to dig up through here, we are going to level out on this slope a space for a patio on this slight slope. And then we're going to create, with some of that concrete and some of the stone we were digging up, a little retaining wall and create another terraced area that's a better planting bed, which also makes the feel of this sunken meadow be even a little bit more sunken as a separate garden area. And so that's the plan, kind of combining a lot of the things we talked about. Most people probably won't be doing all of these things, but I like using it as an example because I can show you how all these things might come together. And so now I'm going to just show you the pictures through the process. Big broken up patio. So this was, heaved enough that it's hazardous to catch a toe or something like that. This is a lot of work. You definitely want people who have strong backs, or if you think you might need to hire help for this, then go for it. So it kind of fractured things, broke them up, attempting to keep as much of a line along certain edges as possible to keep the places we wanted, and kind of did that with a jackhammer that I rented from Home Depot, electrical, using a pick to kind of heave these pieces up and kind of sculpting to the best I could this edge. In some places, just to kind of get a control on the edge after I did the rough breaking up, I used a handheld sledgehammer and a chisel. This was a whole lot of work, but totally worth it. Here's the area where we're going to need to let water pass through from the French drain coming along the front into the garden. So busted that up. And then spent that time picking through the best pieces to build this broken concrete patio. If you're interested in how that might be done, we have a separate class called Installation and Establishment of Waterwise and Native Landscapes. And I show more pictures about the process of building something like this. The price is right, very inexpensive, but very heavy. It definitely took a while. Here is, we got the garden planted because we wanted to get the right season, but we left the space to be able to dig. Here's the trench for that French drain. And here, if you're digging it at the edge of a lawn, you might be constricted by where the pipes for the irrigation system are. So we just carefully dug down. And when we got to the pipe, which was about 9 inches deep, that's where we stopped. So you can see here, also modified the irrigation system while I was at it to better support this diverse size landscape, because the pop-up sprinklers for the lawn would just shoot right into the side of it, and then move them in a little bit into the inside edge of where the French drain is. We have a retrofitting turf irrigation systems for Waterwise and Native Gardens class, where I walk you through that whole process. If you're interested, that's on our YouTube page. And you can see the gravel being delivered. Here's where we dug underneath this one section. This happened to be an area where people had to walk by, so just a piece of plywood to keep things safe until we were done. And then I just got a large piece of pipe to kind of control when there's a lot of water flowing through, have it picking up less soil. So you can see underneath here, had to have it be a little bit wider here so it could realign and go underneath the fence. And then into the backyard, here's where we were constricted, where I mentioned we have this planting area from breaking up the concrete patio, but we had the area for our raised vegetable beds. And so what I did is I really wanted to figure out on site what was going to work. I knew this was going to have to be narrow, but I wanted to have it be wide enough to open up to start to look like a dry stream bed. And so the kind of chalk line here, I really just used an old bag of flour. And so I marked out how much walking space am I really going to require to be around the edge of this raised bed, where I need the landscape to be flat. And after that, it can start sloping down into the dry stream bed. And then I just kind of started drawing things out. I mean, I had the plan in mind, but if you have a square shovel, just the corner of that square shovel is what I like to use to dig in the dirt. And then as I need to redraw things, I can just flatten it out with my boot or with the face of the shovel and re-scrape it, just to get things roughly figured out. And so seeing it's going to be narrow, it's going to be wider, we're headed down towards the final infiltration area. Tools. If you don't do a lot of digging, when you are digging, you need a spade, a pointed shovel. A flat shovel is good for moving gravel or a pile of soil or materials, but it will get you nowhere when you're digging. If you're doing something like this, you also, for spreading mulch or gravel, are maybe going to want to rake. And then what you want to do is you get your trench started, and then you're going to pop out soil kind of from either side. So if you're doing a large digging project like this, it's always easier to get it started, and then you're putting your shovel down into the soil, but you're lifting it into area that's already been dug out, which means there's less resistance. Keep your back flat and lift with your legs. See, I have a bad back from moving heavy stuff around for too many years, so I wear a back brace when I do it, even with good form, just to make sure that I'm not going to mess myself up. And so here it goes. And so you can see working that in, and you might need to stay flexible. So what I found out as I was digging this is right where I wanted things to get a little bit wider, there was I guess you would call it a stump of where a huge palm tree used to be. And I worked on that for days, for hours with a pick. And that thing was so fibrous that just things were moving a little bit, and that's just fine. And so before it got filled with gravel, got a rain event. And so that was great. I got to make sure everything was working and do some tweaks. And so you can see the French drain. So this is not flooding anymore. You can see because the grading on the asphalt, and the asphalt's old, there's a little puddle, but world of difference from how it used to be. There's water coming through. As I broke up the concrete, I saved the biggest, best pieces, which required a dolly and 2 people to move, to be these large stepping stones that eventually would be surrounded by gravel. You can see here how the water feathers around it. Doesn't flood. This whole area used to flood, doesn't flood anymore. And this wasn't done yet, but I just wanted to make it functional because we need to get our plants planted. And this is the reality. It's great to do it all as one big project, but if you're doing it yourself, sometimes it's done in stages. And so eventually this got wider and more naturalistic, but we set it up to make it work ahead of time. See, digging up old roots from trees that were no longer there. Here you could see, originally I had this idea that this would be a sunken seating area that floods, but this big palm stump and roots had a different idea. So that's fine, had to be flexible. But you can see how I mentioned the dry stream bed was going to turn into some areas where there were going to be infiltration kind of stations. So this was still one area, and then a little kind of berm, really not built up, but just kind of not dug out, and then a little overflow down into the next area. And then we were building a little bridge out of 2 pieces of broken concrete that also could get overflowed. And then the final infiltration area, you see in a big storm event how much water that accumulates. And so continuing to work, you can see starting as we got more soil, starting to build this terrace. Just quickly, you can see looking up, bringing in rock. And so you can see here, this is our French drain, but before the pathway started, we had just enough room to have a hint of a dry stream bed, which became the French drain. Here, we're still just starting to mix in a little bit of larger rock for a more natural look. And eventually the plants can grow over the edge of it. That's just fine. It's still going to function underneath. Here along the side. And so here you can see here the gravel filled in, the stepping stone, so easy to walk across. We can still push a wheelbarrow across it if we're maintaining the other part of the yard. And here you can see the Western meadow sedge. These are from rose pots. You can plant it from tiny little plants with the sedges that grow in. And you can see using the broken concrete and then rock to build a retaining wall and a bit of a bench so we can sit here, read a book with our feet in the grass. Planted some small trees that are starting to provide shade a few years later on. And then working with, to retain this for the terrace, a couple of spaces to make nice planting areas, just with the rock that we dug up, because we happen to have a lot of rock in our space. But this made the young plants a lot easier to water. And again, less water, that's going to flow down, less erosion, keeps everything cleaner. It looks kind of nice as the plants grow in. And you can see here, it could totally take flooding. And here it is on its way. And it took me, still quite a bit of time to get around to rocking it all in. It's just things that I worked on a little bit at a time. And here it is the Western meadow sedge, more grown in. You can still see the Western redbud, native tree, which is bigger now, but still just starting to grow in. The sedge grows quicker, mixing in some perennial wildflowers. And then you can see eventually I widened this sculpted it more, started to work in more rock. And it's more done than this, but I'm still have a pile of rocks right here, and I'm slowly making it look more naturalistic. It's a process that's taken me quite a while because I've been working on a lot of other projects, but I got it functional, and that's just fine. It's a project that I whittle away at. And this is it kind of now. Remember, enjoying it as part of your garden really sets off, especially as some of the other plants have started to grow in, the naturalistic kind of landscape. Looks really nice. You can see the little broken concrete bridge that we built over it. We have wildflowers that grow in the cracks in between the pieces of broken concrete, and this lovely, very functional meadow area where now that the trees are growing in, it has more shade. We spend a lot of time here. We have a couple of lightweight plastic outdoor chairs that can move here. My partner spends a lot of time reading here in the mornings in the summer. And this is from our very last rains, where you can see it accumulating water and moving water through with the rocks in it. Now, very functional, no more flooding. So last slides, just remember at their very best, rainwater harvesting elements in a garden are more than one thing. Yes, they're infrastructure. Yes, they're soaking water into your garden. They're turning rainwater into a resource. They're recharging the groundwater table. But there can also be absolutely lovely places for you, and even create little great habitats for, during the dry season, little critters like this western fence lizard. And so with that, the last slide I'm going to lead up just has some of the links that I mentioned. And for those of you who stayed, thank you very much. There's a lot of information to get through, so it's really hard to plan it out to land it on 3 hours exactly. Thanks for staying later. I will answer any more questions that have come in now, but for those of you who are still here, if you can please take just 1 minute to answer this closing poll. That really helps me get metrics for our program tracking, and as well, I'd love to hear feedback. This is one of the more complicated topics that we teach to people who might be interested in doing it themselves or knowing what to ask from their contractors. So I would love to hear any comments in the chat or feedback from you. If there are things that you thought were super useful to you, anything that cleared up something you're confused on, if you had already started thinking about this in the past, I'd love to know about that in the chat. I'm always tweaking this presentation. So for example, I now know that I hopefully should be getting rid of about 15 minutes of content. If I hear from people in the chat something that was super useful, I'll make sure to keep that in. Conversely, if there's anything that was confusing or that I didn't cover that you were looking for, let me know in the chat as well. And I always try to integrate that into future presentations. And so with that, as people finish the polls, I will start answering questions. I'll make sure that the people answering the questions are still here. So question from Mark. When doing the drainage test, is it best to do it when the soil is dried out, or can it be done when the soil is already moist? So exactly. So I think that probably came in right before I showed. You always want to make sure that the soil is essentially saturated, because really what you want to make sure is that you're not going to have standing water or flooding problems after it's been raining for days. From Mark, have you ever used an electric shovel for your digging? So in soil that's either heavy or sometimes with a lot of gravel. Yep, sometimes I'm not quite sure what you mean by electric shovel. So there is something called a roto hammer. It's almost like a small electric jackhammer that has what's called a spade bit. That's like a mini shovel that can be used to really quickly loosen the soil. If you have very heavy soil, those can be great on projects. If you have soil that's pretty diggable, that's not going to help much. But if you really need to break it up, those can be a great tool. They're not going to help you loosen the soil out, but it will, lift the soil out, but it'll help loosen things and then make it a lot easier to dig. Just be very, very careful that you know that there are no irrigation lines or anything else. Something that I definitely should have mentioned, and I thought I had the slide in there, but now I'm realizing I didn't mention it, is that before you do any digging, you should definitely call Dig Alert if you're in Southern California. See if there's a local service near you if you're not. That is, I believe, 811. It's a free service that will come out within 72 hours and mark any underground public utility lines. So if you have for your own property, water lines or things like that, they won't mark that. But especially in newer developments, sometimes there's fiber optic lines or other lines like that. They will mark them so you don't go through them. So when you're digging with an electric shovel or a roto hammer, if you do that, you can just go right through lines. This is my only word of caution. So question from Therese, if you are still there. My entire yard is surrounded by cinder block. Is there any way to mitigate the radiant heat during SoCal's hot summers? Absolutely. The yard I grew up in that I helped my parents do a garden redesign on has the exact same thing. Plants are the way to do it. Whether it's a vine over the cinder block, which sometimes because of that radiant heat can take a little while to get established, but eventually can. Depending on the vine, you might need a trellis. Or my favorite, if you have the depth, is just a mixed hedge of native plants along the property boundary, which can be very beautiful, great for habitat. But once you have vegetation over that, it's going to feel more like a garden, and the cinder block won't be getting hit directly from the sun, so you'll have less radiant heat. And most native plants that can take full sun can get established through that hot microclimate of that radiant heat and grow in just fine. From Sophia, wants to know if Claremont is within our service area. Claremont is not within our service area. We are a San Bernardino County area, so we're super close. We cover Upland, but not Claremont. But you're welcome to participate in any of our workshops. Come check out the WaterWise Community Center. And as well, a lot of what we offer, and we have kind of, instead of one-on-one, like we're working on a lot of DIY content that we continue to add to our Inland Valley Garden Planner website. In terms of landscape design, I'm almost done editing. I've been saying this for a couple of months now, but hopefully no more than another month, editing a massive series of videos, which walks people through the whole process of doing a really nice landscape design for themselves, kind of step-by-step using that website. So check out all of that, and definitely come check out the demonstration garden. What types of tools do you need to cut through concrete? From Natalie. Depends on what you are trying to do. If you're just trying to break it up roughly, like I showed, a jackhammer will do it. Probably one that's going to be heavy enough and expensive enough that you want to rent it because you need something pretty high powered. And it's hard work. If you are trying to cut through more accurately, then you can rent a specific saw for doing it. It's normally those concrete saws also connect with a hose for wetting the concrete down as it goes. It's a whole production. It's a very advanced DIY project. You can definitely, there's YouTube videos that will show you kind of like what you're in for cutting concrete. But it's either for someone who's really comfortable with tools, or for, if you have a friend or a family member that is one of those handy people, if it's not you, to get some help with, or to hire a contractor for. Okay. Let's see, moving on for questions. From Allison. You mentioned that you might have a very hard kind of like lens or level of soil in your yard. Mine seems to be only 6 inches or so below the surface. How can I loosen that up in order to integrate a French drain or a swale? In most cases, it's going to be physically breaking it up. And that tool that I mentioned that you can rent, or someone could rent, or a contractor will have, a roto hammer, is often the best way to do it. And then depending on your situation, if you have the ability to break through that layer along the whole French drain or swale, or loosen that up, that's great. Sometimes in the bottom of a swale, breaking through in just a number of places if you can get down deep through that layer. So if you're digging a swale, it just might not be physically possible. If you need to, if the depth of that hard layer is like another 18 inches, it might not be physically in the cards for that whole thing to get dug that deep, just to loosen the soil. You can experiment with punching through in maybe 4 or 5 places, maybe a 2-foot wide diameter area, where I showed those areas where you might dig out those deeper holes and fill that with gravel. And that might help. And it might have to be some trial and error to do that, but you will figure it out. One thing that you can do, though, to figure out what you're in for is you want to make sure that digging deeper is going to help. And so that drainage test, like if it's hard 6 inches down, dig that 1 foot deep hole and see what the drainage is at the bottom of that 1 foot deep hole by doing that normal drainage test. You might find that if you dig out to 1 foot deep just to remove the soil, you're already through the worst of that hard layer. So hopefully that helps. Okay, from Lauren, any recommendations for designers in Seattle? Okay, so yeah, definitely. I don't have any direct recommendations for anyone in Seattle, but I do know that there are lots of ecological landscapers and designers in Seattle, probably more so than you can find around my area. So a couple of places you can look in general is, if you're, depending on the scale of your project, if you're looking to hire a landscape architect, there is the ASLA, or American Society of Landscape Architects, where you can find a directory. That won't necessarily be ecological type of landscaping, but more and more landscape architects are just needing to at least consider this stuff in it. So there will probably be plenty. If it's a smaller kind of project where you might not need a licensed landscape architect, there's also the APLD, which is APLD. It's the American. Now I'm getting confused on the P. It's a landscape designer organization, and I'm pretty sure it's the APLD, but I'm looking it up now. I can't believe I'm blanking on it. APLD. Association of Professional Landscape Designers. That's what it is. So I typed those into the chat. Those can be different places to start. And then also, you might contact local botanical gardens, especially if there's any local botanical or public gardens that really have an ecological bent, that you might be able to get you in touch. And then also nurseries. If there's nurseries that sell, like, especially your local native plant specialty nurseries, like I mentioned, there's that connection to that kind of holistic watershed thinking. Chances are you can talk to a local nursery that specializes in native plants, and they might know some people. So from David, do you offer a PowerPoint of this rainwater harvesting presentation? You can download a PDF with each of the slides. So essentially it's not PowerPoint format, because that's kind of clunky to share, but it's a PDF where it's a full page for each of these slides. And that's at that, I'll type the link in again, cbwcd.org/presentations. So that's all of the basically slide decks as PDF files. So you can refer to them. And hopefully that helps. And then Annie also typed in, depending on how active your county is and what state you're in, there's also local master gardener programs, and they might be able to provide advice as well as potentially connecting with landscapers. Okay, just a couple more questions. From Mark, which of the plants you showed would be best to plant in a berm, if any? My large wall slightly slopes to cinder block wall that runs the length of the front along the sidewalk. Water always collects here when watering the lawn or when it rains. So depending on the look you want. So the first thing I would recommend is, let me see, I'll get out of the PowerPoint presentation. That'll be the best thing to do. And I will show you quickly where you can get my best recommendations. It'll be more than I can mention here and better information. So here's the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. So if you go to helpful lists, one of these lists, I think down at the bottom, because it's my most recent ones, are plants for dry stream beds. And the full name, which wouldn't fit there, is plants for dry stream beds, infiltration basins, and swales. And so we have plants that thrive along the rim or nearby dry stream beds, infiltration basins, and swales, but not down inside of them. And this is just a sampling of plants that general native plants, some of which will take advantage of the extra water, some which don't really care, but are going to be perfectly happy kind of next to it, but not in the flood zone. But their roots are going to be just fine being close to that water. There's way more plants. And then the second list is plants that will thrive in those areas that flood. And so here are going to be my top choices. And then, like everything else on the website, you can get the full, in addition to working in that situation, you can get the full everything else that it needs and how to maintain it to make sure that the other characteristics are going to work well for your landscape. So hopefully that is useful. Back and okay. Okay, so for David, the PDF info. So if you open the chat window and you scroll up just a little bit, I typed the link in there where it says cbwcd.org/presentations. Okay. Another question. And I could go till about 12:30, so just a couple more. I think we'll get through everything. I was thinking of a berm in front of a wall with a small retention area. Would be the best solution, or would a French drain probably suffice? Yeah, I think I'm confused. I think maybe you mean swale instead of berm, or maybe the berm is in front of the wall to hold the water down into like infiltration area. That might be the case. Yeah, if there's a way to hold that water so it's not sitting right at the base of the wall, that might be ideal. Although a cinder block wall with the concrete footing is not going to be that prone to really huge issues if there's some water at the base, especially if it's been happening there for a long time. Okay, now I see that's part of the same question. In general, especially if it's at the bottom collecting area, I would favor a more open swale, maybe with some plants in it, rather than a French drain, because as a bottom collecting area over time, whether it's silts or mulch or something else, stuff might collect there, and that's just easier to deal with and also retain kind of that retention than a French drain, which might get clogged up at like the very bottom kind of final resting space over time, especially in a big rain event, if there's leaves or whatever. Also, if there's just leaves blowing in the wind that collect at the bottom of the yard, that all has to be managed more actively for a French drain than it would be for a swale down there. So hopefully that helps. And then mixing in maybe some of those plants from the list. Okay, that gets us through the last question, brings us to 12:30 on the dot. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. For those of you who haven't seen this website before, this is the website that we've specifically created for Southern California, but really most of this will apply to much of California that's not true desert or mountain or like the Northern California wetter areas. And this helps people find plants, detailed plant profiles of most of the water-wise plants people are likely to use in their yard. We don't have, like, for people who are into natives, every species of manzanita, but we have, our favorites for the average home gardener to be successful with. And you can do things like, I want a California native shrub with low water needs that's going to be in a part sun area, and maybe it's going to be a good plant to attract butterflies. and that'll kind of narrow things down. That's a very specific one, but if you get rid of that, everything else except butterflies, then from all the plants that you might want to plant, here's our top 20. Full sun, there's obviously a lot more. So full sun, and I want it to be a hedge or a screen. Again, that'll get you down to 9. And then each of these have a detailed profile, information for Southern California about water schedules, maintenance needs for all of them. That has not much. And then we also have a whole section about garden design, where we figured out kind of 8 kind of main themes of what people are interested in these days. And each of them, we have plant lists and design examples, including kind of perspectives and also the bird's eye view planting plans that match them. So you can kind of find things to emulate. And each of these themes has a large, medium, and small yard, front yard examples, a full plant list, and other kind of information. And we're working on a lot more content all the time for this website. So that's that. Check it out. Come check us out at our demonstration garden in Montclair. And definitely, if you have not already, sign up for our newsletter, which I'm trying to pull down to the bottom. There we go, cbwcd.org/newsletter. And so I'm going to say goodbye. Thanks for spending a good chunk of your weekend with me learning this stuff, and happy gardening.